limited government an oxymoron? So tell us about limited government and then what the ultimate limited government is in your estimation.
Well, first of all, I am not a fan of government in principle. I don't feel that the institution, as radical as this may sound, is necessary. There are two ways people can relate to each other, voluntarily or coercively. And as Mao Tse-tung pointed out, government comes out of the barrel of a gun. So I don't approve of government in principle. And I don't think that it's either salubrious or necessary in today's society. Anything that needs to be done will be done by entrepreneurs. You don't need the dead hand of the state on the market.
Yeah, but Doug, look. Here's the situation. I mean, you're talking about anarchy, and you're talking about a situation where it would seem to me without government, then it would be whichever private person or private group had the biggest set of private guns and they could run over anybody else and get what they wanted. Why don't we need government to get in the way of something like that?
Well, the situation you just described is exactly what we have with government. The government's got the guns and it's controlling everybody else. Look, in a civil society, government, perhaps you can make an argument, should do three things. Since government is force and coercion, it should protect you from force within its bailiwick, police, protect you from force outside its bailiwick, an army, and supply a court system so you can adjudicate disputes without resorting to force. And if we had a society like that,
you could sign off on that.
I'd be all right. I could live with it. Unfortunately, those three functions are so important to the running of a civil society, they can't be trusted to the kind of people that inevitably go into government, who tend to be busybodies and power mongers. And always, this is the problem with limited government, is it tends to grow like a cancer over time. And as evidence, I offer you the history of the United States itself. No, I don't think that government, as shocking as this is to say, serves a useful purpose. It's not really necessary.
Okay, Tom, now you've heard this, shall we say, off-the-wall stuff. Where are you on limited government or anarchy?
Well, Dennis, for years I was one of these people. We got to return to what the Founding Fathers thought. We got to get back to the 10th Amendment. We got to return to the Constitution. And, as the years go on and you see that you observe this government and how utterly removed it is from the government we were intended to have, after a while you start wondering, look at all these think tanks sending out direct mail fundraising appeals. We've got to cut wasteful government spending, and nothing ever happens, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You wonder, maybe I am chasing a unicorn here. Maybe there is no such thing. Maybe if you say, this institution has a monopoly on the power to tax and a monopoly on the power to initiate violence, but it will simply restrain itself to a few itemized tasks. I mean, it seems to me unrealistic. Moreover, I think there's a moral question here. If we're going to believe that there are certain moral principles everybody has to observe, why are those moral principles abandoned when we apply them to government? So, for example, you and I can't steal. The government can steal and call it taxation. You and I can't kidnap people. The government can kidnap people and call it military conscription. And it just goes on and on and on. If we believe in absolute standards of morality, the government always fails. So I fall not on the bomb-throwing side of left-wing silliness on this issue, but I follow Murray Rothbard, and anybody who is intrigued by this or thinks, heavens, wow, a forbidden thought, heaven forbid we can't have this on the airwaves, I would recommend going to Google and reading an essay by Rothbard called Anatomy of the State. You'll never look at the world the same way again.
Wow.
And let me add, you use the term anarchy, which I'm very comfortable with, but most people say horrors. We can't have anarchy, that means chaos. And I would say no, anarchy is actually the opposite of chaos. What we have today in society is a type of controlled chaos, if you would. And an anarchist doesn't mean a guy running around with a black cape with a little round bomb looking to destroy things. Sure, you have violent anarchists, just like you have violent dentists, violent Christians, violent shoe salesmen. But it has nothing to do with the essence of anarchy. An anarchist is simply one who believes that every person should control himself and not be ordered by some coercive power on top.
Well, it's interesting. You guys may have read this pamphlet that Mark Skousen, Mark Skousen, by the way, for those of you who don't know him, is an economist who is sort of the guy who runs Freedom Fest out here every year. He wrote a pamphlet called Force or Persuasion, I think, or Persuasion or Force. I'm not sure exactly what he said, one of the two. But Doug, what he said in that pamphlet was is that the more government you have, the more a society is failing, because you need more coercion. You get more. Does that thought resonate with you at all?
That's completely correct. The essence of government is force and coercion. And as Tacitus said in the 2nd century, the more numerous the laws, the more corrupt the society. And this is, of course, why the United States has become more corrupt over the years, as we have so many laws which allow officials in power to dispense favors arbitrarily as they will, and collect bribes for dispensing these favors and so forth. No, the institution of government itself is corrupt and corrupting and unnecessary in an advanced society. In fact, in primitive days, it might have been possible. It was never moral, never ethical, but it might have been possible for the king in a primitive society to say, well, you take that ox cart and you charge so much for your wheat and so forth, because it was simple, and perhaps a simple society could be directed. But today, with billions of transactions every day by billions of people, it's not only immoral, but it's technically impossible for the government to try to direct these things.
Well, you mentioned that technically impossible. First, Tom, I'd like you to tell our viewers who Friedrich Hayek was, as an example. And then he wrote a paper, I think it was about 1945, about knowledge and how it's just impossible for any one person or small group of people to know enough to make all these decisions for everybody else.
Well, Hayek belongs to a school of economic thought called the Austrian School of Economics. He won the Nobel Prize in 1974 for his work on central banking and how it screws up economies. So another example of how we don't need these institutions. But Hayek's essay on the use of knowledge in society was based on the idea that it's impossible for any one human mind to amass all the knowledge that would be necessary if you wanted to centrally plan society. Everybody's got his own localized knowledge. He knows that if I take this truck route, even though technically it may be longer in an extensive sense, nevertheless it's more efficient to go this way. There's no way a central planner could know that. We've all got a lot of implicit knowledge that we just sort of know instinctively, we wouldn't even know to verbalize. And so, in other words, if you were to make any sense whatsoever of the productive structure and try to give it some rational direction, you wouldn't know where to begin. It would be impossible, be the height of hubris to think you could substitute your judgments for the judgments of hundreds of millions or billions of people who actually have the relevant knowledge necessary.
Doug, I was debating a lady in Irving, Texas, over 25 years ago, on a topic of mass transit, actually, and she was convinced that we ought to have government running transit, and so you can imagine where that went. But I asked her, as I've asked a lot of people, and I would ask that viewer to think about this right now too, and that is, what is government designed to do, and how would you define government? You defined it in those 3 ways a minute ago. But I asked her that question, and here's what she told me. She said, well, Dennis, government is that entity where we all just sort of sit around as a society and figure out what we can do for each other. That's how she answered that. What would you say to that?
Oh, I would say that that's ridiculous and naive. Look, government, even, or I should say especially, the type that everybody believes in today, democracy. Democracy is really just mob rule dressed up in a sports coat to be polite looking. And I don't believe in mob rule. The best type of democracy and government is the market. You vote for what you want with your dollars and with your time, and if you don't want something, you don't vote for it with your time and your dollars. And that's the best type of participatory democracy there is. And I can believe that's the way that people should relate. The problem with government that these people don't want to acknowledge and understand is that its main products are wars, pogroms, confiscations, regulations, taxations, all the worst things in the world. It produces nothing, and anything that it gives to one group is inevitably stolen from another group, because government doesn't produce anything. It only redistributes things that it, in effect, steals from the producers.
Yeah, but look, Tom, we have to have a safety net. I mean, there are people in society who, either because of faults of their own or no fault of their own, they need an income. They need, maybe they're sick, maybe they're have a medical problem, that sort of thing. Would you just throw those people out on the street? Is that what your idea would be?
Well, if we had a society in which we didn't have this parasitic entity that sucks the life out of actual producers, people whose terrible crime is to add value to society, first of all, the society would be, what, 3, 4, 5 times wealthier than it is right now. Think of where in the world you would most like to be poor. Would you like to be poor in the United States, or would you like to be poor in North Korea? Or would you like to be poor in Bangladesh? Look at the societies on Earth where the poor are doing the best, and it is consistently the societies that have the most economic freedom. Now, in terms of welfare state, well, there's been an awful lot of sociological research on this that shows that actually these programs have, in fact, entrenched problems they were allegedly intended to solve, but that what in fact they do is they make people dependent on the state. This is just the type of relationship the state likes to have with people. But look back to the 1960s, before medicine was so heavily bureaucratized. Are we reading in the newspaper that people are dying in the streets and we're walking over corpses on our way to work because they can't get medical care? You find that the poor and the wealthy had about the same number of hospital visits, costs were reasonable, physicians understood that part of the moral obligation they had as physicians was to give free or low-cost medical care to people. I mean, this sounds like a society from Mars, right? Whereas today we have this gargantuan regulatory mess, and we think this is what free market medicine causes. So I would say that the private productive sector and the voluntary sector can take care of these people, and your local parish would take care of these people rather than let them starve. But these gigantic budgets, like the New York welfare budget, has consistently 70% of it goes to overhead. So it's not even as if you would have to replace dollar for dollar what the government is doing. And moreover, if you look at in the 60s, when people were learning that the government is waging a war on poverty, and you look at voluntary giving, it goes right down, right down. Then you look in the 1980s when welfare spending was actually increasing, contrary to popular belief, just increasing more slowly. It was still growing, but people were under the impression that it was being cut mercilessly. And then you look at charitable giving, it's exploding during the alleged decade of greed.
Interesting. Now, Doug, I would imagine, he mentioned the health care issue, as it relates to government, this idea that Obama is floating now about totally changing the health care system. I was briefed by his top economist for the Society of International Business Fellows when I was in D.C. 60 days ago, and here's what the economist told us. He said, first of all, we're going to make health insurance available to all the 45 or 48 million who are uninsured. Secondly, we're going to increase the quality of health care. And third, we're going to lower its cost. What are the chances of those three things happening?
Slim and none, and Slim's out of town. No, it's not going to happen. Look, it used to be that people treated paying somebody to take care of their body much the way they treat them to take care of their car. You put some money aside so in case your body breaks, just like you put some money aside in case your car breaks. And that's the way it ought to be. I don't think that there wasn't medical insurance actually before World War II, and medical insurance wasn't needed because the costs were lower. No, the whole system has got to be washed away and changed at this point. And the government doing what it's trying to do now under Obama, it's only going to have the effect of cementing the poor people to the bottom of society by making them ever more reliant on the government and therefore less reliant on themselves. And it's going to put even more mandarins in charge of the national government, generally rich people who are going to pay off their rich friends. So you're going to have increasingly in the United States an upper class and a lower class, and the middle class, which is what made this country great, is going to increasingly disappear in the years to come. This is why I've said for some time that we shouldn't even call this political entity we live in America. America was a wonderful idea. It was a fantastic idea. But America's gone. It's disappeared. It's been replaced by the United States, which is just another of 200 political entities which cover the face of the earth like a skin disease at this point.
I'm glad you don't have a strong opinion about it, Doug. Now, Tom, you mentioned a Nobel Prize one. I'm going to mention another one. Jim Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize, I don't remember, sometime in the 90s, as I recall, wrote an article not too many years ago about the idea of dependency, a mindset. And so I guess my question is this. You can rail about government being bad and all that, but ultimately, isn't it the individuals who decide that they want something from the government and then they go to their political leaders and get something? I mean, what role do we as individuals have in order to try to reduce this Leviathan that you don't care much about?
Right. I mean, I don't care much for. I would say that in a lot of the blame has to be placed on individual people themselves, in spite of the fact that we can mitigate this to the extent that people are educated in government-run schools, which isn't this an interesting coincidence, which teaches them that the government is their friend and it supplies them with free services and it defends them from their enemies, and they get all this wonderful view of government, so of course they believe that we are the government and the government is just my servant, and they believe all this nonsense that has nothing to do with the real world. But leaving aside the fact that they've been brainwashed into believing utter nonsense, it is still a fact that, as Albert J. Knox said and as Franz Oppenheimer said, there are two ways to acquire wealth. I mean, you can work for it, you can produce something that your fellow man wants, you can produce some service, or you can steal it from him. I mean, that's basically it. Those are the two ways. They're mutually exclusive. You can get it voluntarily, or you can steal it. And given that human beings prefer to get the things they want by means of the least possible exertion, well, they're going to prefer to take what Oppenheimer calls the political means of acquiring wealth rather than the economic means. That is, going to the government, getting the government to loot their neighbor. And I don't even mean necessarily, by the way, exclusively poor people. I'm talking about competitors who can't compete very well, so they file antitrust complaints against their competitors. Antitrust law, it's not like competitors, pardon me, it's not like the general public says, I think this company is too big, I'm going to file a complaint. No, typically these companies are offering you bargains, low prices, the opposite of what government offers you, and it's the competitors that say, oh, I can't compete with you. So typically what happens is people want to exert themselves as little as possible, and they use the government to cripple their competitors or steal from people, or in some illicit way that we would in any other context consider absolutely immoral. We consider this politics and compromise.
Well, another economist who was born even before Doug and I were born, Bastiat, how do you pronounce his French name, but he wrote a little book called The Law, and that's really, I think, what you're talking about. So tell that viewer what he said back in the 19th century and why it's still so powerful today.
Yeah, Bastiat wrote a tiny little book you can read online just simply called The Law. And it's one of these 50-page little tiny booklets that can change the way you think. But the main principle of the idea was that we have come to believe in what he calls legal plunder. Now, plunder is the idea that I can just go in like a pirate and just steal things from you, and that's the way I'm going to live. Well, we would consider that to be illegal plunder. Legal plunder is when we use the government to go take that thing, and suddenly that becomes the height of morality. So he says there are three ways we can organize society. Number one, everybody plunders everybody. Number two, some people plunder other people. Or number three, nobody plunders anybody. And for some reason, we consider number two to be the ideal, the height of morality, the only way human beings can interact with each other, and it's considered crazy extremism that you would even consider that there might be the humane alternative of nobody plundering anybody.
Doug, I suppose that's probably the option you'd like to have too, isn't it?
Yes, I believe in a civil society, and unfortunately the state, contrary to all of its representations, creates the opposite of a civil society. It becomes a war of all against all.
The book that Albert J. Knox wrote called, was it Our Enemy, the State? Is that what it is? And he, I think in that book he differentiates between the government and the state. Give us some sense of, you may not differentiate it at all, I don't know, Doug, do you or not?
I'm not sure if I really make that distinction. Look, as an anarchist, that's I believe in an orderly society, but society self-orders itself. When you go into a restaurant, or for that matter, into a Walmart, you don't need the government. The government provides no useful purpose in those places. The owner of the restaurant maintains order there. The manager of the Walmart maintains order there. You don't need the state in those instances, and I can't think of any places where you actually need the state.
And moreover, the state creates problems that it then blames on the private sector. So when its crummy price controls lead to shortages of meat in the 1940s, the president blames the farmers for hoarding the meat. And in fact, Truman actually considered sending out the Army and the National Guard onto American farms to confiscate the meat that he was sure was being hoarded there. Or when prices rise, well, this is because of greedy labor unions and businessmen. Or when there's an economic collapse, such as we've endured, well, that's because our wise government didn't regulate these people enough. Look, the whole system is screwed up. It is so screwed up that it doesn't matter how much you regulate it, that people will find ways around it. When you have a system that has a Federal Reserve System that has proven itself willing and able to bail out any market actor that acts like an idiot, what do you think is going to happen? People are going to be more likely to act like idiots. You know, big surprise. And then we say, well, we just need a little more regulation. No, what we need to do is cut this awful root out that is encouraging this type of reckless behavior. And we also need to remember that the guys who graduate from business school and then go and become regulators, those weren't the brightest kids in business school. I guarantee you, the brightest kids don't become regulators. They go off and start businesses. So in other words, the dumb kids are going to try and regulate the smart guys. If the system isn't sound, you can chase them around with regulations all you want, and you're not going to get what you want.
It's very funny relative to what Tom was just saying about Truman accusing the farmers of hoarding, because just a few years before, Roosevelt was accusing the farmers of overproducing, so he was pouring milk in the gutter and slaughtering pigs. So what we're dealing with when we're dealing with politics is a dramatization of people's psychological aberrations. And unfortunately, the kind of people that go into government are the kind of people that have the most aberrated psychologies. They're the kind of people that actually think they have a right to control what other people do and have and think.
Is there any way out? I mean, how can we get from where we are to where you'd like to be, or at least move the needle in that direction?
Well, I'm afraid that as we speak now, we're in just the very early stages of what I call the Greater Depression. It's a period of time during which most people's standard of living, here in the United States anyway, are going to go down significantly. But it's also a time when distortions and misallocations of capital in the marketplace are liquidated. I think that in the next 10 years, we're going to see as great a change in American society as we had during the Depression and World War II. It's going to be a huge change. Now, how society is going to reorder itself, that's up in the air. I hope it reorders itself with a much smaller state, a much smaller government, and much more individual freedom. It might go exactly the opposite way.
Okay, Tom, we just have a minute or so left. What's your prognostication, or at least a prescription as to how we change this thing, if you'd like to see it changed to the better from your standpoint?
Well, I think the only mechanism available to almost anyone is just education, and that's a very thin reed, because as I said, people want to get what they want with the least possible exertion. And if you say, hey everybody, I'd like you all to read these 5 books, you might as well be speaking Chinese. So the best we can do is spread the word using the internet, using all the means at our disposal to explain that what you've been told is basically a lot of bunk, and that the people you're taught to admire and wave incense before are frankly parasites on the productive sector of the economy, who are the real heroes of our society.
But I see right now a group of constituents who benefit. I mean, there's a huge percentage of this country, if we're old, we got Social Security, if we're on Medicare, and that sort of thing. How do you get around that?
Well, we realize that in the future, the young kids now aren't going to have anything. That the average 65-year-old is going to get about tens of thousands of more, $70,000 more than he put into the major transfer programs. The average 25-year-old is going to pay in about $300,000 more than he's ever going to get back. I mean, that's not sustainable either. So I mean, something's got to be done, and we have to think about what that might be.
Last 15 seconds, Doug, are yours.
We're headed for very big trouble in this country over the next few years. It's it's not going to be fun to be here and be involved in this. So I'm spending more and more time out of the U.S. so I can watch this on my widescreen as opposed to out my front window, because it's going to be potentially very catastrophic.
Hey, this is Larkin Rose, and something has come up a lot recently in discussions with people in person or in discussion lists or in comments under YouTube videos or wherever that I hadn't yet made a video about, so I'm making one now. Those familiar with my stuff know that I'm pretty regularly bashing the concept of minarchism, the concept of limited government, and the idea that we can make a government that serves us and that's legitimate and that only protects us. And I bash the Constitution, which is along those same lines. And a lot of people say, well, can you be a little more gentle and not so nasty? Because a lot of people start with that. A lot of people start with minarchism and don't just, run them over with a steamroller. And I sort of sympathize. I started with minarchism. I mean, many years ago, like 16 or 17 years ago, I was still a minarchist. And for years before that, I believed in the Constitution and believed in political action. I thought if we can just get the right people into power and vote for this or that, or write our congressman and tell them to vote against that, and I played the game and accomplished exactly nothing. But to me, it felt like that was the thing to do. So yeah, I can totally relate to the people still playing that game. And, my message to them isn't, you're never going to be any good, you're worthless, go hide in a corner and don't do anything. My message is, that's a great first step. It's an essential first step. Hardly anybody gets to freedom without that first step into minarchism, but if that's where you stop, it's worthless. And that's the thing, when people first get that hint that something's wrong, that the government shouldn't be doing this to us, that it shouldn't be doing this and this and this, and we're mad about that and that and that, that's a good sign. It's a start in the direction of realizing, we should be free, they shouldn't be doing that to us. You can go back 800 years to the Magna Carta, where the people figured out this radical idea that, hey, well, mostly it wasn't even the people, it was the local lords and stuff, but they basically said, the king shouldn't actually be allowed to do anything he wants. Not absolutely anything he wants. There have to be some limits on what he's allowed to do to his people and his subjects. And that was a radical idea, and for most of humanity that never occurred to anybody. Well, he's the king, he can do whatever the heck he wants, we're just his humble servants. So that first step had to happen. Now, the first step was pretty dang lame by itself, but it had to happen because it was people starting to wake up to the idea that maybe there are limits. Maybe he doesn't all the way own us. He only owns us kind of a little bit. And the step into minarchism in the Constitution is saying, well, the government can't just do whatever it wants. There have to be limits, and it should be trying to serve us and blah blah blah, all the rhetoric you've heard over and over again. And so I don't want to bash people for taking that first step, but if that's the only step they ever take, it's worthless. And the strange thing is, I know a lot of people who've gone all the way to voluntarism, to anarchism, and understand that government cannot be legitimate, it cannot be a good thing. It's like limited government is like limited carjacking. We just want carjackers who protect our cars. Well, carjackers don't ever do that, and if they did do that, they wouldn't be carjackers anymore. Likewise, if government ever only protected us, they couldn't tax, they couldn't legislate, they wouldn't have a monopoly, they wouldn't be government anymore. So if you want to reduce them down until they're not government anymore, that's fine. But as long as they are government, they're authority. But when people are going in that direction, it really matters if they stop or not. And a lot of people say, here, you bash Ron Paul. I don't actually bash Ron Paul. I do bash the political process. And I was actually thrilled to death when I saw Dr. Paul's comments on the House floor, his like farewell address or whatever you call it. The last thing he said on the House floor before leaving, he said about himself exactly what I've been saying about him for months. And I'm sure it didn't just occur to him, he's understood this whole time. He basically said, and I highly recommend people go watch it, I'm paraphrasing here, I haven't seen it for a while, but he basically said, legislatively I accomplished nothing. We didn't get anything done. I said no lots of times and things passed anyway, oh well. the political process, Dr. Paul got pretty much nothing done within the system. He dragged his feet on a bunch of totalitarian stuff, most of which just ran over him. But he said, and this is what just amazed me, is that he dared to say this: government is not the solution. You cannot fix this by way of government. What matters is what people believe in, what they understand. If the people actually understand freedom and want it, then you actually get good results, and government is just kind of irrelevant. And on other occasions, he's said things that, to me, hint that he's a closet anarchist, or maybe even not even closet, because he's said, ultimately, he's mentioned the word voluntarism, and ultimately he wants a voluntary society where there is no coercion, including by way of government. And he said things like, we can't delegate to somebody else rights that we don't have. Well, that completely rules out government all by itself. And he said, people in government don't have rights that we don't have. They're still just people. And it's thrilling to watch somebody, incidentally, Dr. Paul is just a miracle, in my mind. How anybody could be in Washington, D.C. for that long and not turn into a principle-free monster just amazes me. And he still played the game of legislation and tried to get stuff done, but he seems to totally understand that, well, that doesn't really do anything. What matters is getting the ideas out. So, back to the point of this, lots of people say, well, Dr. Paul is the one who started me on my journey thinking about things. That is outstanding. That is excellent. He has probably pushed more people to the first step, which led them towards anarchism, than anybody else I can think of. And it was just funny because Ron Paul doesn't say he's an anarchist. He has used the term voluntarist, but I don't know that he's ever described himself as that. But he's definitely sympathetic to the idea of, how about if we don't have government stomping on us? But yeah, he's started lots and lots of people on that journey. And that's the thing, is if that first step kind of has to happen. I mean, and the strange thing is, I know self-avowed socialists who we've talked for a while, and they read some things, and in the span of a few days or a week, they went all the way from statist socialist to anarcho-capitalist, and in sort of one fell swoop. But on the other hand, I know lots and lots of people who say, I want a little tiny government, just the Constitution, minarchist. I'm a minarchist, I want a minimum amount. And, well, what does that mean? Like, minimum, what's the minimum? Like, I think the minimum is 0. Why isn't that minimum work for you? So it's sort of this vague thing of, we want not very much. But I know lots of people who have been stuck at that point for years and years and years and just won't step across that line. They cannot examine in their own head the belief in authority in government. They say, no, we have to have it to protect us. We need it to protect us. That's all it should do, just protect us. And never mind that never in the history of the world, anywhere in the world, has there ever been a government that only protected people. It's never happened. In the history of humanity, it has never happened. And yet there are still lots and lots of people that say, we need it to do that. Okay, so we need government to do something that it has never done in the history of the world. In all the times it was tried, in all the variations, all the forms it's taken, monarchy, democracy, republic, blah, 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 it has never been only a protector. The first thing every government does is say, we have the right to steal your money, only we're going to call it taxation. Every government does that. And in this country, when people say, let's get back to the Constitution, let's try again what completely failed the first time. Well, this time we'll try harder. It led to this. Why wouldn't it lead to this again? Never mind, forgetting the fact that there's no way in hell you can get back to what the Constitution was anyway. It's not worth getting back to. It led to this. And if we don't learn from our mistakes, if we say, okay, well, let's start over and do our mistake again, maybe this time it'll magically work. That's why I bash the Constitution and minarchism, is because it cannot lead to freedom. Begging for a nice master cannot lead to freedom, because you don't even accept that you're free inside your own head. If you actually think you have an obligation to bow to somebody else, even if it's a limited government, well, they can only tax us in certain indirect ways, and they can only regulate certain little things, and then the state governments can regulate other things. If you still think that, you're never going to be free, because you literally believe you're somebody else's property. And so, when I bash minarchism, I'm not saying everybody who believes in it is dumb and evil and should shut up and go away. I'm saying excellent first step. And if that's the only step you ever take, you freaking lose. And you will accomplish exactly nothing. But that first step almost has to happen. Like I said, I know a few people who skipped that and just went from a flying leap from basically totalitarian to anarchist. But for almost everybody else, including me, because I spent years and years going through the minarchist constitutionalist routine, for almost everybody else, it's a necessary first step. So I'm not saying don't take that first step. I'm saying do take that first step, but don't stop there. If you stop there, you accomplish nothing. Follow through on the logic, follow through on the principles. I mean, talk about non-aggression principle and I own myself and freedom and stuff. If you think these things through, eventually you realize government just kind of evaporates and it can't be legitimate. I mean, that's what I went through. And when I wrote The Most Dangerous Superstition, the whole point of writing that is I want to help other people through this stupid, clumsy, idiotic journey that I very slowly went through for years. I want to help other people do that more comfortably and more quickly. And I'm thrilled to say lots of people are telling me it did that. It got them through it more comfortably, more quickly. But I did the same thing. So I'm not saying, if you believe in minimal government, you're evil, shut up and go away. But you have to keep going. And the problem is, most minarchists have almost no experience arguing in the other direction. You look out at society and it's a bunch of totalitarian, state-worshipping, collectivist boneheads. And from the minarchist point of view, almost all they're ever doing is saying government shouldn't do this and it shouldn't do this and it doesn't have the right to do this and it has no business sticking its nose in this. And that's what they talk about day in and day out. And then somebody comes along and says, hey, what if it doesn't do anything? And they're not, minarchists aren't experienced of arguing against it. They're so experienced at arguing about all the things government shouldn't do. But when you say maybe shouldn't do anything, well, I think we have to have it for something. It's not a direction their brain has gone, because their brain has been fighting in the other direction against statists, saying all the things government shouldn't do. There shouldn't be vice crimes, there shouldn't be this, that, the other thing. But if you just accept the concepts of, if you think through the idea of self-ownership, the non-aggression principle, these things just logically completely rule out government. And if you look through the rhetoric that we're taught about servant governments, which is ridiculous, it rules us while it serves us. No, that doesn't make any sense. Or representative government. It does things that none of us have the right to do and is somehow representing us. And also, while it's representing us, it bosses us around and takes our money. This rhetoric is just bizarre and doesn't make any sense. And eventually it falls away and you see the lie underneath if you keep going at the principles. And so, yeah, I love the fact that Ron Paul is out there talking about actual principles and starting people on this journey. And I think it's, for constitutionalists and minarchists, it's their job to nudge people to that first step, to start thinking about things. And for others, like myself and Stefan Molyneux and a gazillion others, it's our job to get the people who've made the first few steps and say, here's the end, you can do it, come on. And again, this isn't to be condescending, because I did that too. I took years to accept the bleeding obvious that I own myself and that I cannot possibly have an obligation to bow to any external authority above my own judgment. And now it's so obvious, I think, how on earth did it take me years to see that? It's like taking years to figure out that 1 + 1 is 2. So, and the only reason it takes so long is because we're working against indoctrination. But, yeah, so I completely sympathize with the people who start out, and I know tons and tons of people, and most of them are doing the journey a lot faster than I did, who are at the minarchist stage. And I know a bunch of people who were at the minarchist stage a few months ago and now have totally given it up and understand that government is a lie and authority is a lie, and the whole paradigm on which the political field of thought is based is insane. It doesn't make any sense from the ground up. So, yeah, if you made that step to minarchism, outstanding, way to go, great. If you stop there, boo, you lose. Keep going. Keep applying the moral principles. Keep applying the logic. Keep thinking about it until inside your head, the lie of government completely dissolves and you realize what the world really is, which is piece of dirt with billions and billions of people who all have the same rights. None of them have the right to rule. No legislation gives any special power to anybody. People with badges and costumes are still just people. They don't have any extra rights. We still have the right to defend ourselves against them when they commit aggression. And all that stuff, all the stuff I talk about all the time. So all I'm saying is if you made the step that you doubt that government has the right to do anything it darn well pleases, and you think in some cases they can't do that, and we have the right to resist, good. Just keep the logic going, keep the thought going, apply moral principles, and as long as you are consistent inside your own head, don't be scared of where you end up. Because you will end up an anarchist if you keep thinking about it and you keep applying the non-aggression principle and self-ownership, and you can't delegate rights you don't have, and all that stuff. You will end up there. And that first step has to happen to get there. But a second step has to happen too. And a third, and a fourth, and a fifth. And if you ever stop the journey, if you ever decide, okay, this is the line, I will not go beyond, I'm not going to think anymore. I'm going to cling to government and my superstitious belief in it, and I'm just not going to examine that. I'm not going to look any deeper. Then you lose, and the rest of the world is going to pass you by and arrive at voluntarism. As long as you dare to keep thinking and debating and discussing things, excellent. The first step has to happen. As my brother says, if something never starts moving, it never goes anywhere, which is kind of obvious. So, yeah, take the first step, then take the second one, and then keep going. And don't stop until you're consistent inside your own head. And when you get there, join the club and start advocating real freedom, also known as a stateless society. Hey, Larkin Rose here. Let me start with a disclaimer. I'm going to try not to be too insulting and fired up in this video, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to fail. The topic here has to do with the ridiculous mythology that we're taught about consent of the governed, will of the people, democratic republic, and constitutional yada yada yada. And there's one particular example that I think just perfectly illustrates how insane all that garbage really is. And this one example has to do with what's been going on in Colorado and the state of Washington, where at the state level, the people have spoken. They said, we don't want people violently caged for possessing a certain flower, namely marijuana. We don't like that. We have spoken. We changed the laws. And Obama basically said, oh, well, that's nice, but I don't really care what you want. I'm going to continue to send in my armed thugs to attack people for possessing marijuana. So there have been armed invasions of marijuana dispensaries all across Colorado and Washington state. And this has been happening relatively recently. And for this, I'm not even talking about the concept of drug prohibition. For those who haven't seen my video called Drug War, Huge Success, here it is. If you're wondering why the heck I would say it's a huge success, go watch the video. But the point here isn't about the actual issue of marijuana. It's about the mythology we're taught and about the fact that if this doesn't illustrate how insane Civics 101 garbage really is, I don't know what will. Let's review. You have the people of Colorado, or the people of Washington state, who a bunch of people worked really hard to vote to change the laws so people don't get violently caged for having a flower. And they win. They got their way. They voted, the majority spoke, the people of Colorado, the people of Washington state spoke, they got the laws changed, it's legal, and Obama said, I don't really care. I'm going to keep sending in my armed thugs to attack you for doing something legal. Now, think of the terms we're taught. First of all, consent of the governed. And for each thing, I want to look at the federal government and the state government. Consent of the governed. Obviously, the people of Colorado did not consent to what Obama is doing. They very specifically unconsented and said, we don't want this. We want this changed. We don't want people caged for having this flower. And Obama said, I hear what you're saying. I hear that you don't want that, and I don't give a crap. Here come my armed thugs to force my will on you without your consent. So consent of the governed, the federal level, out the window. How about the state government? The state government said, well, we hear you, people of Colorado, or people of Washington. We hear that this is what you want. We also hear that Obama wants to attack you anyway, and, well, we're siding with Emperor Obama. We don't really give a crap what you stupid people want. We're going to step aside and let his armed thugs attack you for doing something legal in the state that we're supposedly in charge of. So, will of the people, out the window. Consent of the governed, out the window. Democracy, out the window. The federal government said, yeah, we see you voted for that, and we don't really care. State government said, yeah, you voted us into power, and you voted to declare that this is no longer a horrible crime that we cage people for, but we don't really care. We're going to let him attack you anyway. Him and his stupid, mindless mercenary goons, we're going to just stand there as you get attacked. Same thing with law enforcers in Colorado and Washington. You know, if it says protect and serve on the side of your car, please rip that off and throw it away. Drop your badge, go home, because you've already demonstrated that you're a bunch of irrelevant freaking cowards. Literally, there is armed robbery happening right under your noses in your state, and you're letting it happen. So if you have a badge, or if you're a state legislator or governor in Colorado and Washington, stop pretending that you matter. I mean, those state governments have basically said, we're not in charge here. If Obama says he wants to do this, we're going to let him. Never mind that our laws say that you're allowed to do that, that what you're doing is perfectly legal. Mr. Obama still wants to violently attack you, and we're going to let him. We're not going to stop him. You know, this is the moral and legal equivalent of the government of China saying, we don't really want people in Colorado to have marijuana, so we're going to send the Chinese army over to attack them, and having your state government saying, whoa, who are we to question the Chinese government? We're going to let them attack you, sorry. Remember, for those of you who care about legality garbage, and I don't believe in state governments any more than I believe in federal, it's just a fine example of how neither of them give a crap what you want. They don't care about consent of the governed or will of the people. They don't represent you. And so you have this situation where basically this foreign armed invader says, we're going to tell you what to do. And the state government says, yeah, we're not going to stop them. State cops, yeah, we're not going to stop them. We're going to let them attack you. So basically the state government is saying, we're irrelevant, we're powerless, we're not in charge here. Emperor Obama's in charge. And Emperor Obama's saying, yep, I'm in charge, and I don't care what you vote for. I don't care what your legislation says. I don't care what the state constitution says. I don't care what the federal constitution says. I can do anything I damn well please. And so far, the people of Colorado and Washington have agreed. Emperor Obama can do whatever he pleases. Doesn't matter that there's no constitutional authority for it. That's how trite to even bring that up. The document which pretends to give them all their power to begin with doesn't even pretend to give them that power, but, whatever. We just let them get away with it. Will of the people? No, he obviously doesn't have that. He doesn't care. State government doesn't care. Apparently, the people of Colorado don't care either, because they're just letting it happen. There's a term for this situation. The term is totalitarianism. Now, when you think of totalitarianism, you might think of lots and lots of people dying horribly. Well, yeah, sometimes that happens. But what term would you use other than totalitarianism to describe a situation in which a government has no limits on what it can do? And that's the final term to totally make fun of. Limited government. Really? Where are the limits? The Constitution doesn't give them the power. That didn't matter. The people voted against it. That didn't matter. The state government said, yeah, it's now state law. You're allowed to do it. That didn't matter. What limits? See, the reality that people don't want to face is that there is only one, in the real world, setting aside all the mythology and civics garbage we were taught, there's only one limit on government power, and that is the people. If you, the people, don't limit it yourselves, it's not limited. Frederick Douglass gave a great thing about this. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what the people will put up with, and that's what's going to be imposed on them. And that will continue until they resist. Patrick Henry, same thing. He talks about liberty and says that nothing will preserve it but downright force. And whenever you give up that force, you're inevitably ruined. Yep, they both got it. If the people aren't going to limit government, government isn't going to limit itself. I mean, it's ridiculous to even have to say it. It's like saying, well, we have a limited mafia in our city. Oh, really? How does that work? Well, they have a piece of paper in their, head honcho's office and the Don's office that says things they're not supposed to do to us. Oh, and do they abide by that? Well, no, not really. And then what happens? Nothing. If they don't enforce it on themselves, we don't resist because they're big and powerful and we're just stupid little nobodies. That's the situation. That's no more ridiculous than pretending we have limited government in this country. Obama just gave the perfect illustration. And this is, there are a million other ways to see this, but this one is just so clear and succinct and perfect that the federal government has declared they don't care what you want, they don't care what you voted for, they don't even care what the legislation says, for those of you who believe in that stuff. They're going to do anything they want. And the state governments have come right out and said, yeah, we're going to let them do anything they want. We don't care what you want, you the people, what you voted for, what the Constitution says, state or federal. We don't even care what our own friggin' laws say. We're going to let armed invaders attack you, ha, and our mercenaries aren't going to do a damn thing to protect you. Please, someone tell me how that is not totalitarianism. There are no limits to this government. And the only time there ever will be is when the people are willing to make the limits be there by resisting. And I know the people who have been indoctrinated into the statist mythology don't want to believe that. They want to think, well, we can vote. You voted in this. You won. What good did it do? We can petition to change the law. You did, and you won. What good did it do? For all those people pushing for drug legalization, you got it. What good did it do? You still have armed invaders violently attacking and robbing people for something that doesn't hurt anybody and is legal. You have literally armed robbery happening in Colorado and Washington, and the state governors and legislatures and all of their myriad of spineless enforcers below them are saying, yeah, we're not going to protect you. The emperor has spoken, and he's in charge. We're not. We're just irrelevant little window dressing. This is called totalitarianism, and if there's one good thing that comes out of this, is it's a great illustration of how that mythology is just ridiculous. The fact that anybody still repeats it is ridiculous. The fact that anybody plays the game and legitimizes the game, how much more ridiculous can it get? You really want to vote again? Whether you win or lose, Emperor Obama is going to do whatever the hell he wants to you. You really want to change the laws? Whether you win or lose, Emperor Obama is going to do anything he damn well pleases to you, and nobody in the state bunch of parasites is going to do a damn thing to protect you. This is pathetic, but it's nice to have an example that's this pathetic that shows that all that crap we're taught about limited constitutional republics and will of the people, it's just crap. If you're going to act like slaves, to the people of Colorado and state of Washington, if you're going to act like slaves, at least please stop repeating the lunacy. Just come right out and admit that you are owned by Barack Obama. You are his property. He can do anything he damn well pleases to you. I mean, you've already made that message come across loud and clear with your behavior. Your behavior in the state legislatures and the badge-wearing chicken shits in Colorado and Washington who are letting this happen, who are letting illegal, immoral, armed robbery happen to the people of Colorado and Washington and not doing a damn thing to stop it. That's pretty sad, but just come right out and admit it. Just come right out and say, we are the property of Barack Obama. He can do anything he damn well pleases. Now, I'm picking on Obama because he's the current lunatic, sociopathic narcissist who currently sits on the throne. Exact same thing with Bush and pretty much all of them going back forever. In fact, the war on drugs is more often a right-side authoritarian, collectivist, fascist, fun little game of violently attacking people. But doesn't matter who's on the throne. You've just admitted that you're serfs. You're the property of the king, and you're not going to do a damn thing to stop it. Like, you tried to work within the system, and you won, hooray, and it didn't do any good. So, to all those people who say, oh, don't talk about resisting and breaking the law and disobeying, we got to work within the system. Really? You did. For years and years and years, you did, and then you won, and you still lost. Now what do you do? All those people who believe in voting and petitioning, now what do you do? The state and federal governments just said, we don't give a crap what the law says. We don't care what you want. We don't care what the will of the people is. We don't care what you voted for. We don't care what the legislation says. We can do anything we want to you, and you're just going to sit there and take it. Are they right? So far they seem to be. People of Colorado, people of Washington, any of you have a spine? Any of you going to stop this? Or are you going to accept that, never mind democracy, never mind the law, never mind constitutions, Obama or whoever sits on the throne on any given day can do anything they want to you, and you're gonna let them. Howdy, Larkin Rose here. I thought I'd do a quick video about an argument I see now and then, not from statists in general, but coming from minarchists and the people who are so close to all the way understanding the reality of the situation, but just don't want to give up that last little bit of residual statist indoctrination in their heads. And so I see this now and then on a fairly regular basis. I found a thing, it's titled The God Called Government, and I'm going to read from this because I think it succinctly sums up the bogus argument. It's making the bogus argument. And then I'll respond to it here. But I've seen a bunch of variations on this. So this is, I'm going to skip a whole bunch of this because a lot of what this person wrote I actually agree with. They talk about, you can't delegate rights you don't have. Aggression isn't okay, and forced extortion isn't okay, even if you call it taxation. So again, most of the way there, but then just couldn't take that last little step. So here we go. I'm going to start reading under the heading of legitimate government. So it says, so if government is such a tool for oppression, and if laws should be broken if they are immoral, why have a government at all? First, there must be a clarification of what legitimate government is. What makes the United States federal government any more legitimate than a street gang who claims an area as its turf? This is not quite as easy to answer as most people would think. And then it goes through a few things that, again, I agree with, like the fact that something is legal doesn't make it moral. The fact that something is voted for, even if it's approved by the majority, that doesn't magically make it moral either. And it points out how a bunch of the worst tyrannies in history were legal and they were voted into existence and all that. So I totally agree with bashing those excuses for legitimate government. So, okay, so far we're on the same page. Then it says, it's a bit disturbing that it's hard to define the difference between your government and a street gang. At least the street gang is honest about its threats, but the politicians are always smiling and shaking hands with their victims while pretending to be so caring and compassionate. So far, so good. Then it says, so shall we do away with government and just have one big free-for-all? No. If the strong can use force to get what they want from the weak, as happens without laws or police, the concept of God-given human rights will be a memory. In addition, and I'm sure you've heard that argument before, that we need it there to protect individual rights. In addition, anarchy never exists for any length of time. As soon as there is complete anarchy, authorities begin to reappear, whether in the forms of gangs, dictatorships, democratic governments, or militias. Then we are back where we started. You've all heard that argument as well, as, it'll make a vacuum, it'll make a power vacuum, and governments will come in and take over. So here we go. So what is legitimate government according to this person? I'm sure you've heard this before. So what is a legitimate government? Government has one legitimate job and only one legitimate job: to protect the God-given rights of every citizen. And this duty comes only from the right of individuals to defend themselves, not from the name government. So once again, you have somebody who they all the way understand that individual rights is the thing that matters, the thing that needs to be protected, but they think there can be such a thing as government that only protects individual rights. Like, this person doesn't comprehend the fact that if you had an organization or a group of people that only protected individual rights, it wouldn't be government. It couldn't tax, it couldn't legislate, it wouldn't have any special territory or jurisdiction, it wouldn't have any authority. It would be indistinguishable from the people right next to it who say, if you want to hire us to help protect you, we can do that too. So it also doesn't have a monopoly. But there's this clinging to the propaganda and what we've always learned and what we've always heard everywhere and what we've always believed about government. So even people who all the way understand enough that they should obviously have come to the conclusion that government is inherently aggressive and therefore inherently illegitimate, and that government and a thing that just protects individual rights are totally mutually exclusive. There can't be a thing that's both. But there are some people who, because of their indoctrination, they're still trying to cling to that idea of, well, I want a protector government that only does these good things, that only defends individual rights. And this person just doesn't freaking understand. But I'm using this as an example because it does succinctly express the bogus position of a lot of people, of a lot of minarchists. So it goes on, with government as with individuals, the only good use of force is in defense of someone's freedom. True, except if that's the only thing it does, it isn't government, it isn't authority. Goes on, imagine a large group of people with no government. When someone in the group attempts to violate another's God-given rights by injuring, killing, or stealing from another, the intended victim has a right to defend himself. Okay, that's totally true. Because the victim is often unable to defend himself adequately, the group appoints some individuals to deal with those who try to violate the rights of others. They also create written laws based on the idea of God-given rights, which can be simplified as no one shall willingly deprive another of life, liberty, or property. See, this person still has a remnant of the authoritarian fetish in their brain, and they think, well, we need a law that says that. Like, we need some holy written down thing, as if that makes it legitimate. Like, defending yourself doesn't require somebody to write something down and do some dumb ritual and say, no, it is the law of the land. It's just a description of reality. I mean, that's just as dumb as saying, well, 2 + 2 won't really equal 4 until we have a math authority that writes down, we hereby declare that 2 + 2 = 4. Like this, and I can sympathize. I can sympathize that they're trying to reconcile the statist indoctrination with understanding individual rights, and they don't get that they can't be reconciled. There can't be a government that's only a protector, and the notion of law and having a final decider, and we're going to have this all-powerful thing that does the right thing, that does the good thing, that protects us. And one of the most pathetic things about this this mentality is it's still trying to imagine a superhuman entity that will make sure everything's okay, despite the fact that I'm sure this person would admit that never, anywhere in the history of the world has government only done this. But there are still some people who argue we need to have government because we need it to do this thing, just protecting individual rights and nothing else. Even though not only is it never done that anywhere in the world at any time in history, it has always been an aggressor, it has always been a violator of individual rights, but every single time it has ever been tried, it has been the opposite. It has been an aggressor, like I said. It has been the violator of individual rights. So they're basically saying, we need to hang on to this thing that has not only never done the thing that we say we need it for, but has always done the exact opposite and made it worse. So it's frustrating to see people so close, but who are still so clueless and couldn't let go. So he goes on, the reason for putting the law into writing is to have everyone know what acts are considered a violation of another's rights and what the consequences will be for committing that act. Okay, but why do you need to call that law? Like, I could write down, if you try to break into my house, I'll shoot you. Like, I don't have to pretend it's law, I don't have to pretend I'm authority. If it's just a matter of letting people know, here's what we're going to do to you, like here's what we feel justified doing ourselves, that's just kind of a threat or a warning. It doesn't have to be law, it doesn't have to be authority. And the notion of having some centralized authority declaring those things, immediately it's a bad idea, and immediately it turns into authoritarian control. The only freedom a legitimate government ever takes from an individual is the freedom to deprive another of freedom. In this case, it becomes clear that government is simply a hired enforcer for the people, nothing more. Government does not have the authority to make up laws that are outside of the realm of protecting freedom. Well, what are you going to do to stop it when it does? Well, vote really hard. It is not allowed to be exempt from law. When it uses force, it is the force of self-defense that rightfully belongs to the people, which they in turn extend to the hired government. I see this argument so often, and it's so misguided, and I can sympathize with it, but it's so misguided to think we need that authoritarian thing doing something that's completely not authoritarian, and that it has never done in the history of the world. But it really is just a problem of not being able to let go of a comfortable belief system that you've had in your head all your life, and it's hard to let go and realize that whole thing start to finish is bogus. So like this person is still trying to like hang on to, well, okay, we still need government, but it needs to be very different. It needs to be this thing that has never been before. Individuals have a right to defend themselves and their property by force. Individuals do not have a right to use force to violate someone else's property. The very same thing is true of government. God does not give government any special rights. That is legitimate government, anything else is not. So I understand, I sympathize with the argument, and it's totally bogus, and people need to question things enough to realize, just let go of the word government, let go of the concept, because I know that this person is like drastically hanging on to, but we need a government. I can't imagine like nothing, like people just being people and figuring it out without some central lawmaker saying, don't worry, this is the right rules that we will enforce. And by the way, if you think I'm being demeaning and like presumptive about what this person thinks and why they think that, and insulting to this person, it was me. I wrote this a quarter of a century ago. Note the name. This was in 1994, when I was still a little bit of a statist, and I understood enough of the principles that I should have known better, but my brain was still doing the tap dance, still trying to imagine that there could be such a thing as government that was only a protector, because I didn't want to let go of that security blanket of a big centralized power that will make sure the right thing happens, because I didn't realize government is completely incompatible with that. So yeah, that was me, and that's what I thought back then. So I thought that was worth, and I found this recently. I wrote it 25 freaking years ago. And I thought it was funny. Oh, incidentally, I have a new daily podcast called Unbound Podcast, and I've been reading chunks of this to study my own psychology and study back when I was a statist. And it's sort of funny, but it's sort of frustrating to see all the things I got right, but the things I just wasn't able to let go of yet. But I thought it would be funny to point out that, because I bet anything there's a bunch of minarchists out there going, yeah, this is right on, he's right on. No, he wasn't. He didn't know what the hell he was talking about. And I know because I was freaking him. It's me. Because I read a bunch out of this to study the things I still didn't get. Because, it's a little bit embarrassing, but I think it's useful to look back at yourself and other people, who used to be statists and then figured out. Because the more we understand the things that were in the way of us fully realizing reality, like there were still things in the way of me grasping actual freedom, the better we can be at communicating those ideas to other people. So yeah, I'm sort of proud of the things I got right, and it's slightly embarrassing, the stupid things I was still arguing. But at least I'm allowed to be really rude and mean to this author without anybody getting their feelings hurt, because this guy doesn't exist anymore because he sort of got a clue and is now a voluntarist.
And so there was a point at which we discovered that being a minarchist, somebody who believes in a night watchman state, was not enough for us to feel comfortable, and so we made the transition. And so having Larkin Rose in studio, I wanted to talk to him about that transition and how we might be able to get other folks on our side and get through that transition, because it could be a painful one. So Larkin, I want to start this conversation off by saying what I hear quite often, which is those minarchists, and we'll define minarchy as somebody who believes in a limited government, perhaps a constitutionalist, somebody who thinks that we need a state for police and fire and law courts and things like that.
Right.
So what I hear from a lot of people is minarchists and anarchists, that's a very small percentage of degree. The minarchist believes in the market, believes in the efficacy of the market about 95% of the time. We anarchists believe in 100% of the time. That's only a 5% difference. Like, why can't we all just get along? Aren't we all just fighting for the same liberty? I hear this a lot, and I think you have a problem with that sentiment. So what is your problem with that sentiment?
Well, the idea that we have a common enemy, like being able to point to something and saying there's something wrong with that, doesn't particularly impress me. It's easy to say, this isn't working. And so a lot of minarchists say, well, we both agree that this isn't working, so let's go say how loudly this isn't working. My problem with that is that most minarchists don't actually understand the underlying problem. They can see the symptom of the problem, which is a giant government that bosses people around and steals their wealth and destroys the currency and violently cages people and things like that. But they still miss the underlying cause. And it's not enough. Like, I don't doubt their intentions, and I don't think, they want to evilly rule the world. I don't think they're the bad guy, but I think there's a lack of understanding of the underlying problem and therefore the underlying solution. And if they don't get that right, basically they will try the same thing that's been tried for thousands of years and never works, which is trying to create a government that works for the people. And of course, that's what the Constitution pretended it was going to be, and that's what limited government advocates always want. It's just going to serve us, it's just going to protect us, it's just going to do these certain things. And if we agree, if between minarchists and anarchists we agree it shouldn't do this or this or this or this or this or this or this, can't we just focus on getting it to not do that? And the problem with that is, if you want it to do these three things, it's going to end up doing them all. Because the moment it's authority, the moment you imagine government to be legitimate and you give it power and you give it the power to tax, the fact that you, one of the subjects, says, you can take my money, but only for these things, it's going to remember you can take my money. It's going to forget, but only for these things. Because as soon as you put it above you, it will grow into a thing that is beyond your control.
Right. That's something we hear quite often, is the limited government position is big government is bad, but government isn't bad.
Yeah.
And you're saying that if you say that big government is bad, but government itself isn't bad, you've given away the whole game. And a limited government cannot stay limited. It eventually expands and grows. And so what do you think is the underlying problem with the minarchist position of limited government, that they fail to see that their government always has to, by reflex, grow to be this gigantic monstrosity?
Because they leave the seed in there that will always grow into a monster, which is the belief in authority and authoritarianism. And they want it to be little, but what they want doesn't particularly matter. And the problem is when people want an authority to be the good guy. They want an all-powerful thing just to protect us. Not to be mean, just to protect us. And so they want to create a thing that's more powerful than normal people. And they'll say this, I don't trust normal people. We want something bigger and more powerful than them to stop those bad guys. And then you build that, and then you suddenly realize, oh, it's also bigger and more powerful than me. And then once that institution is there, the ultimate paradox and insanity of minarchism is, I don't trust people to run their own lives, and therefore we need a thing bigger and stronger than those normal people that I don't trust to keep them in line, run by those people that I don't trust to run their own lives. And it's often in the language you'll actually see that they haven't really thought about. We need government because I don't trust people. And the obvious response is, well, what species is government? Because if you're taking some of the people you don't trust and giving them lots of power because you don't trust them, that doesn't make any sense. But the way minarchists talk, they still speak, and I did for years when I was a minarchist, they still speak as if it's going to be something with more virtue and more wisdom than the human beings who are in it. Even though history shows us the exact opposite. The worst people around will be first in line to be in a position of power to control others. So the intention is good, but the intention of the communists was good. The intention of the fascists was good. We need an all-powerful thing to make society be the way it should be. But the moment there is that all-powerful thing, what that all-powerful thing will care about is the all-powerful thing. And the subjects become livestock. And if you start with a little one, it'll take a little while longer, but it's still going to be an all-powerful thing that cares about itself and inherently an enemy of humanity.
If a minarchist says, I feel very strongly about the abilities of the market to provide 95% of goods and services, but the last 5%, I can't comprehend how it might happen. I don't get how a market for fire protection might work. As long as we have this mechanism called elections or voting, doesn't that mechanism prevent the kind of runaway growth that you're talking about?
Not at all, not in any way. And to me, most of what has to happen is just people clarifying in their own head their own thoughts and their own understanding of what they're talking about. Because when people say, I don't trust the market to do, I trust it to do lots of things, but I don't trust the market to do this, I back them up and say, well, what do you think the market is? The market is a term we use to mean human beings interacting voluntarily. Mm-hmm. And that's all. I mean, it generally has an economic connotation, but it means people interacting voluntarily. Mm-hmm. So what it says when somebody says, or what it means when somebody says, in this realm, I don't trust the market, what they're saying is, in this case, for protection or whatever it happens to be, I don't trust people interacting voluntarily to have a good outcome. Well, there's only one alternative to voluntary, which is involuntary. And the other word for involuntary is violence. So it's what that is really saying, whether it's a little thing or a big thing that they don't want the market to handle, is I don't trust free people to do the right thing. I want my concerns and my preferences violently imposed upon them by a gigantic state, because that's all there is other than the market. Anything that isn't coercion is by definition the market. So if you don't trust voluntary, you are trusting involuntary, which is violence. And I remember going through the process of finally becoming clear on that and realizing, yeah, I don't see any way in which initiating violence is going to make people less violent. I mean,
right.
How obvious can it be?
Was there a process in your deconversion from believing in the state where you had to figure out how a market, the voluntary interactions of millions and millions of people, could produce X, Y, and Z? Like, did you have to have like this blueprint? Do you have to read The Machinery of Freedom and see like, oh, well, maybe courts could work because of all these mechanisms and the incentives are aligned and all that? Did you have to go through that, or was it just the fact of being inconsistent made you so uncomfortable that you just said, screw it?
Yeah, for me, it was I was dragged down a route, kicking and screaming, trying to hang on to my statism, that most of the anarchists I know didn't go down that route. Most of them seemed to get there by comparing, all right, society with government, society without, how would they work? What, which would end up better? The economic considerations of, yeah, we could do things this way, which is a perfectly valid way to get there. I accidentally got there a completely different route by figuring out that it's impossible for government to be legitimate. An analogy I often use is there isn't a question of, will Christmas work better with Santa Claus or without Santa Claus? There isn't a Santa Claus, and pretending there is not going to make Christmas work. There isn't a legitimate government. There can't be, and I can prove it really easily. My book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, proves it 3 different ways in all of 10 pages. And once you accept that we cannot create a legitimate ruling class, instead of saying, oh my gosh, what would happen without it, you just go, oh well, we don't have it. Let's start being responsible adults and figuring out how to deal with each other without it. It really is just, it's a psychological crutch that people use to get out of the responsibility of being adults. Because I don't want to have to think about taking care of the poor or protecting me. Let's have some big authority that does it. It's a complete cop-out.
You know what, I can just, this is where you're going to lose a majority of minarchists. And they're going to say in their heads or out loud to you or me that they, for example, Justin Amash, this congressman who everybody seems to like, who's very, very seemingly libertarian, and, they can be like, look, this guy, he's a minarchist just like me. He votes that way. I voted for him. He's legitimate government. He got my vote. I love what he does. He always votes the way that I would have voted if I were in the House of Representatives. What's wrong with that guy? I mean, he seems like a legitimate guy. How is he illegitimate?
Several things are wrong with that. First of all, for him to run for office kind of implies to me, now I don't know the guy and he can tell me I'm wrong about this, kind of implies to me that he believes that the ritual of voting actually changes something about him. Then he's going to be part of the group that's allowed to dictate tax policy, for example. In other words, they're allowed to steal our money. They call it more pleasant things so they can get away with it. And the fact that he says, he might say something like, well, I want to lower taxes drastically. In other words, I want to steal a whole lot less of your money than the rest of those guys want to do. That is still legitimizing. It's still saying the guy who wins this game called the election has the right to rule, but I'm going to be a nice ruler. I'm going to be a nice master. I would never run for office because it doesn't matter how many people push their button next to my name. I'm still just me. I don't get any new rights. I don't become a king. And to play the game in order to give the government's holy permission for us to be free, even if it's well-intentioned, even if he really means to do that, is still confirming the idea that we need their permission. It's like, I will become king and tell you you can keep your land. Well, the first thing you're telling me is that you get to decide whether I get to keep my land, in which case we already lost. We're already still subjects. You can't win. You can't win by politics because politics is the problem, the belief in government. You can't make people free by becoming the new slave master.
I think another way of approaching the same question is, if I really like you and I think, hey, I want Larkin Rose to boss me around, tell me what to do, I really like his ideas, he's fun to be around, I could ask you permission to be my, decision maker, or whatever you want to call it. I don't want to call it a ruler or a master, but I can, you and I can make a contract, but that contract is between you and I, and, you and I both have to agree to it ex ante at least. And so just because I think you're a great decision maker for me doesn't mean that everyone else in this geographic region also agrees to it. And just because you have my consent and I may have, had this contract with you doesn't mean that everybody else has your consent. And so the issue I see with this representation is that there isn't consent for a majority of people, because a majority of people don't vote for a person because a lot of people don't vote, and it's 51%. So where does the minarchists go wrong in their assessment that because somebody won the vote and received 51% or whatever, that consent of 51% now falls upon these other people in this geographic region? I don't understand where that leap comes from. Because in my mind, it's you and I can have agreements, but I can't make agreements for Tom, John, and Susie over here. So where does this false consent come from?
Yeah, that distinction is really, and this offends minarchists, but too bad. That distinction is why I say the minarchists have more in common with totalitarians than they do with me. Because if you accept the notion that, the democracy excuse for authoritarianism, which is, well, most of us agreed to, this taxing thing or this law or whatever it is, and it's okay, therefore, to violently impose our will on everybody else. If you accept that premise, then it is logically follows that it would be moral to say, those people over there, they're not quite as intelligent and productive, and they're only 40%, let's slaughter them. Because if you just establish the precedent that their rights don't matter because the majority can overrule their individual self-ownership, we're allowed to take their property, that's taking their life. Well, how big a step is it to all the way take their whole life in one shot? Just kill them because, the common good would be better off that way. And the moment it isn't on an individual level, the moment this group is making an excuse to violently dominate that group, I don't care how many constitutions you have, how many elections you have, whatever rituals you have, the big impressive buildings and the bizarre things you go through, you are all already advocating the violent domination of innocent people, and you already lost. You can't get to freedom by a different flavor of violent domination. The only, the situation you described, the only time it's legitimate is consensual on both sides. Mm-hmm. And we can agree to something, or 5 million people can agree to something. And if every single one of those agrees, it's called consent. It's called consensus. And in that case, it's not government. And in a lot of the mythology you'll hear about government, especially from minarchists, there are contradictions everywhere. Consent of the governed is a gigantic contradiction.
How so?
If you had actual consent, it isn't government. If we agree to something, neither of us is governing the other one.
Yeah.
If you're being governed, it isn't by consent.
Right.
It's
right.
one or the other. Governing is forcible domination of one by another. Consent is we both agreed.
Yeah. Yeah. But if I'm your employee, if I consent to be your employee, you consent to be my employer, I do work for you, you pay me or whatever. I'm not, now all of a sudden I don't say you're my government.
Right.
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 That's
and
a weird way to call it.
Yeah. But this mythology is designed to try to make it possible for government to be legitimate and serve the people. Servant government, another gigantic contradiction, just inherent contradiction. Everyone knows the government is the thing to whatever degree, whether it's minarchist or totalitarian or any flavor in between. Government is the thing that bosses people around and takes their money. Now, most people use pleasant-sounding euphemisms so it doesn't sound so nasty, but it makes laws, which are commands, and it hurts people who disobey. It enforces the law. And to try to say that, yeah, that guy bosses me around and takes my money and he's my servant is just insane. And I was taught to repeat it, and I repeated it, and most of the people I know repeat it. These are the sort of concepts that demonstrate that the mythology that we're taught of government makes no sense. We only accept it because we hear it everywhere. We hear it from our parents and in the media and from the teachers. We hear it over and over again, and we don't hear anybody say, your servant bosses you around? It's patently ridiculous. But if you don't ever hear that anywhere, people accept it. And in most of what we're taught about government is patently ridiculous.
If, there's a lot of objectivists, I guess, who are minarchists, and they're that 5% away, or 3% away, and they say, Larkin, I agree with most of what you're saying. Taxation is theft, and a lot of them will come out and use Rand's words and say, look, taxation is theft. I mean, it has to be consensual. It has to be voluntary some way. And they go, but I draw the line at competing private agencies and things like that. They're so close because they can see how you can have water and phone lines and roads. Like, they concede all of that. They're just a little better than your standard constitutionalist. And they just say, but we have to have this monopoly on violence because you cannot have a market in violence. I hear that all the time. You can't have a market in violence. How do you get through to those people that are like that final 2% away?
See, all I want from the objectivists and the constitutionalists and the minarchists is be consistent in what you're saying. Advocate one thing that doesn't contradict itself. And to the objectivists who say that, I say, all right, so you have your monopoly on defensive force, and our neighborhood over here says, you're kind of expensive, and we don't think you do the best job in the world, and you're not going to force us to pay for it. Apparently, kind of. Sometimes it's hard to get objectivists
voluntary
to say,
taxes. Yeah.
To be entirely clear on that. So we're going to have our own police force. In other words, we're going to compete with you, and you don't have a monopoly anymore. What are you going to do about it? Now, you have two options. End government by saying, you can do that, or become an aggressor by saying, you can't do that. And they don't want to say either one, so they try to hold the two competing ideas in their head and pretend they don't hugely clash. It's like the minarchists or constitutionalists who say, we just want a government that protects individual rights, and we need to tax you in order to do that. So you're going to threaten me with violence to take my money to protect my rights. If you just remove the conflicts and the contradictions, that's how I became an anarchist. I was a minarchist, and I kept noticing contradictions and removing them. And one day I removed one and realized, poof, government's gone.
Yeah.
The moral, justifiable, rational organization that was left did not deserve the term government anymore. Didn't have a monopoly, couldn't tax, couldn't legislate, didn't have authority. It was just people organizing, in which case there's no reason to call it government anymore. And that's where you have to end up when you remove all the contradictions. Every single person who believes in government still has contradictions in their heads, because you cannot believe in authority without holding competing, diametrically opposed concepts in your head. It can't be done.
I think that's a great way to approach the objectivist, is saying, if in this objectivist world of voluntary taxation, whatever the heck that is, and a monopoly on defense force, if Larkin and Justin get together and say, look, we can do a better job of arbitrating disputes and protecting the neighborhood or whatever, you're left with two options, and that's it. One makes you an anarchist, and one makes you a totalitarian. Yeah. Which side are you on?
Right.
And I think that's, to me, I don't know if I were an I don't know what I would say. I mean, but so I think that's a great way of putting it. Finally, before we wrap up, because I don't want to make this too terribly long, what are some of your books that you have available, and what are some of the concepts inside those books that somebody might be interested in? And where do you see yourself in the future? What are you doing from now on?
The most important book I've ever written is called The Most Dangerous Superstition, and it's about the belief in authority. And I'm not spoiling the punchline. It says that on the second page. And it goes through how people believing in authority and the idea that you can have a legitimate government makes almost everybody betray their own moral codes and their own values and what they care about and what they want. And that's why I see hope is the minarchists don't want to be evil. I mean, devout communists don't want to be evil. I mean, there may be some sociopaths who are an exception, but the problem is not that they're trying to be evil. It's that the belief in authority is such a temptation and such a way to trick almost everybody, whether you're talking about the politicians or their enforcers with badges who, turn into violent monsters, or even their subjects who take pride in, well, I pay my taxes and I obey the law, and they think that equals being a good person. How the belief in authority takes this huge group of people, most of whom are good and have good intentions, and ends up having them fuel and empower a giant parasitic, violent, evil beast called government. And it isn't because they're evil. If I thought everybody was evil, I wouldn't try and talk them out of it. It would never work. I would run and hide in the mountains somewhere. And you have nice mountains here to hide in. You might come here to hide in them. It's that this superstition of authority that we're taught tricks good people into fueling evil. And my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, goes through the different groups of people and how it does that on a very specific level for the different groups. I also have a novel called The Iron Web, which is, it has a lot of the same ideas, but inside a story that lots of people seem to think is fun in and of itself. Like, I didn't want just some lame, stupid story as an excuse to put some ideas out. And people can go on Amazon and see what other people said about it, and I'm rather pleased with the reviews it's gotten so far.
Welcome back, everyone. This is What on Earth is Happening. I'm your host, Mark Passio. Today on the show, we have a very, very special guest, Mr. Larken Rose of larkenrose.com. I'm going to read for you his short bio, and then we'll jump right into it with Larken Rose. Larken Rose is a self-professed, quote, enemy of the state, end quote, and the author of 4 books, 2 of which he wrote while being held as a political prisoner for a year by the gang that calls itself the United States government. He has also written countless articles and done dozens of radio interviews advocating the concepts of self-ownership and a voluntary society. For the sake of full disclosure, Mr. Rose confesses that he is a former member of the cult of statism, and for years, along with everyone else he knew, devoutly prayed at the altar of the mythical deity known as government. Having eventually escaped the clutches of that cult, he now devotes much of his time trying to deprogram as many others as he can so that they too may reclaim ownership of themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to What on Earth is Happening, Mr. Larken Rose. Larken, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mark.
Great. So I figured we could start off by having you tell the audience a little bit about your background and what basically guided you to some of these concepts and topics that you speak about now.
Well, I was raised basically sort of libertarian-leaning, conservative, Republican-ish. Not just my parents, but most of the town I grew up in. And I can't really point to one source that nudged me in the direction I am now. My wife Tessa and I sort of corrupted each other along the way until we both ended up here. But for me, it was really a matter of getting rid of inconsistencies in my own position. Like, I love to argue and I love to debate and I like to win because it's no fun debating and losing. And when I notice problems in my own argument, I have to back up and say, okay, something's wrong there. That didn't make sense. Like, I'm arguing for constitutional government or limited government or whatever, and I get stuck where my own argument sounds stupid to me. And I back up and say, all right, that didn't work. There's something wrong. What do I have to change? Not just about the argument, but about what I actually think. Because if what I think is inconsistent with itself, it's wrong. You can't be inconsistent with yourself and still be right. You can be consistently wrong, but you can't be inconsistently right. So basically, I whittled down more and more about the religion known as government and statism, and found, I started from the position, well, it should only have a military, it should only do the police, it should only protect us, and yeah, it has to do taxes for those necessary things. A position that millions of people still believe and still are in. But when it came down to thinking about the underlying principles, I would come across, wait a minute, if I want this thing to protect us, how does that jive with assuming it has the right to extort people and tell them you have to pay for our quote-unquote protection? And so I started saying, well, taxation should be voluntary. And I realized, well, if it's voluntary, it's not taxation. And so just bit by bit, the whole illusion of authority in government sort of fell apart. And this was this was having debates with people online and in person and reading things. And a lot of it was just having discussions with my wife, Tessa, like I said. And we each corrupted the other one into giving up statism. I'm not sure who won the race, but we both sort of talked about things back and forth until we both ended up realizing there can't be legitimate government. There can't be a ruling class that has the right to be there. And unlike most anarchists or voluntarists or whatever term is less scary for people, I didn't come to the conclusion that we could either have government or we could have no government, and no government would be better. Like on a practical basis, I know a lot of people do. I got there by realizing there can't be government. There can't be legitimate authority. There can't be a right to rule. No political ritual or document or any of the rest of that can make one person have the right to rule somebody else. And if it's impossible, if it can't exist, arguing about whether we should have it makes as much sense as arguing about whether we should have Christmas with Santa Claus or without Santa Claus. When you realize there isn't one, that question is sort of, well, duh, there isn't one. The only question after that is, do you want to live your life based on a lie, imagining something that isn't there, or do you want people's perceptions and behaviors to be based on reality? And really, that's all I advocate, is that people act, view the world and act accordingly based on reality, not based on the mythology we were all taught, having to do with authority and government and law and crime and all the terms that basically imply that we need a ruling class and that there can be a ruling class that's legitimate, and that if we don't all bow to this superhuman thing that keeps us civilized, it would be chaos and mayhem. So
that's one of people's most overarching fears, of the reason that they give for the necessity for government is that if there wasn't any, there would be chaos, and the underlying emotion that drives that position is fear.
Absolutely. And I like to point out that fear, which, and I had it for years and years, and I know we can't have none, we have to have some. It actually, it shows that the belief in government is a blind faith issue. It's not about rational thought and figuring out how to make things work, because the logic of it just on its face is really bizarre. The logic goes like this. Now, people don't say it this way, but this is what they mean. Human beings are so unpredictable and sometimes immoral, sometimes negligent, sometimes nasty, that we have to take some of those nasty, negligent, vicious human beings and give them the power to control the rest of us by violence. As if that's a rational solution, whether we're all nice or all nasty or something in between. But the only reason anybody would ever suggest such a thing, and I often make a comparison that if you're getting attacked by a swarm of killer bees, the solution is not to try to create an authoritarian hierarchy among the bees to have some of them tell the other ones not to sting you. However nasty we are, or however nice we are, taking some of us and giving them permission to dominate everybody else is a really bad idea. And the only reason that isn't obvious to everybody is people are taught to view government as a superhuman entity.
one which we voluntarily choose to abdicate our personal responsibility to. Larkin, hold it right there. This is absolutely great. We'll continue right on the other side of this break. Don't go anywhere, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening here on the Oracle Broadcasting
Network. Constitution like the...
We're back, folks. Larkin Rose today on What on Earth is Happening. Let's jump right back into it with Larkin. Larkin was explaining to us that he had arrived at his current position that all statism, the belief in authority, is a cultish belief system because he stripped away all of those veils that stand between our perception and the truth. And he was able to do something that few people are able to do, seem to be able to do. He was able to set his own ego aside and reevaluate his belief structure. And to be able to say, I was wrong, and then change your mind is one of the most powerful internal works that anyone can ever perform upon themselves. So Larkin, go back to what you had been talking about before, about the idea of handing over authority to people who are basically, fundamentally not perfect in their own right and don't really have any kind of a perfected morality is a flawed idea to begin with.
Right. The notion that mankind is so unpredictable and nasty and dangerous that we need a government. The trouble is, what's the government made of? Well, some of those dangerous, nasty people, in fact, not the best of them, but the worst of them. And most people agree, yeah, politicians are mostly liars and crooks, but they still fall for the notion that for us imperfect human beings, and we are, for us imperfect human beings to get along, we have to find some of the most imperfect and give them permission to violently dominate the rest of us, as if that's going to improve things.
And there are some of the lowest consciousness among us. I would say it goes so far as to the fact that they really are psychopathic, and they are naturally drawn and gravitate to that position because of their psychopathic nature or psychopathic tendencies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you run an ad in a newspaper saying help wanted, come dominate your fellow man and tell him what to do and hurt him if he disobeys, who do you think is going to call for the job? It isn't going to be all the nice people. It's going to be the people who are narcissistic and love to dominate others, which is about as evil as you can get. And that's the nature of the job. The idea, and for ages I fell for the notion that, well, government can be good. We got to watch out for the corruption and bad people getting into power. But it can be good. And no, it can't. It can't ever be good because all it does is threaten people with violence. That's all the law is. And they have all the flowery rhetoric and propaganda that we're taught to try to make it look like something else. But everybody knows that when when the control freaks issue a law, they're saying you have to do this or you're not allowed to do this. And if you disobey, we hurt you. I mean, everybody knows that's the underlying reality of what happens, but people don't talk about it like that. Because if they did, it would sound, basically, if they just stated reality bluntly, statism sounds as insane as it is. Saying we need some people to have the right to initiate violence against innocent people. Otherwise, some bad people might initiate violence against innocent people.
And this is what has been called the semblance of good, which is something that I wanted you to touch upon. People who think this is the right idea only because they fear the scenario that might, not definitely will, but in their mind might come about if this artificial control structure were not in place. And thus they think that this is choosing the lesser of evils or choosing what they, in their perception, believe to be good. Some philosophers have termed this the semblance of good, and almost invariably it leads us down a primrose path that leads to nothing but chaos. Can you touch upon that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's see, I see good news and bad news here. To me, statism is a superstition that people are programmed into, but their own moral code, at least basically, is usually pretty good. They don't run around murdering people on their own. They don't run around robbing people on their own. But they have been taught to believe that if you do certain pseudo-religious political rituals of elections and constitutions and legislation and all these official things in their big grandiose buildings, that what comes out the other side isn't bound by human morality. Like, they're allowed to steal, and because it's called taxation and it's the law, and people really and truly not only believe that that's somehow becomes justified, even though they know if they did it themselves, they'd recognize it as evil immediately. Not only do they think it somehow becomes good when it's done by way of legislation and all these rituals, but then they imagine any victims who resist it as being nasty and bad. So it really, their indoctrination into authoritarianism turns their perception of right and wrong completely upside down, completely inside out, so that literally they view good as bad and bad as good. And they will just vehemently cheer as quote-unquote criminals who haven't harmed anybody are crushed and thrown in a cage or shot or some other nasty thing. Because, yeah, even though in their day-to-day lives they pretty much get the basic morality of, you know, don't start a fight, don't be nasty to other people, when it comes to politics, they have totally been tricked into thinking that evil is good and good is evil, because by way of the political process, they think human morality, there's an exemption. You're allowed to steal if you do it this way. You're allowed to commit mass murder if you call it national defense and you do it this way. You're allowed to boss people around and violently intrude into their lives if you do it by way of legislation and democracy and all the fun rituals that go around the belief in statism. But the good news, I say, is that in their individual lives, most people already get all you need to get to coexist peacefully, which is don't steal from people and don't attack people and don't murder people. It's pretty dang simple. You know, there are always little gray areas that we can work out, but if we get that much, we're doing okay. But
it all really comes down to understanding the real difference between right and wrong, knowing what moral behavior really is, knowing what the transgressions against another's natural law rights really are, which is what you basically just stated. Don't kill, don't steal from people, don't take their property, don't trespass against their lair. Murder, rape, theft, trespass, these are the four basic natural law transgressions. And if we only really respected the self-ownership and the natural law rights of others, we wouldn't have to worry about creating these ridiculous authoritarian structures based on erroneous beliefs, because things would organically fall into place if we just respected that basic concept of self-ownership.
Right, and the reason I refer to the belief in authority as the most dangerous superstition is not only, like, people look to government to protect us from the imperfections of humanity. What they don't get is the only thing they're adding, the only thing that happens as a result of the state is more of those four bad things, because that's all the state ever does. It doesn't come along and make nice, helpful suggestions. It makes commands and it hurts those who disobey. And so the idea that you can make civilization by way of doing things that are exactly opposite to civilization is insane, but it's what we were all taught. It's what I was taught, and I believed it for years and years and years, that we need government, this giant, powerful, violent, control freak mechanism to make us good. And
you can't command moral behavior. Moral behavior cannot be commanded. It can only actually really be taught by those who have developed it themselves and then accepted by others who want to learn it. We'll pick this up on the other side. Don't go anywhere, folks. You're listening to Larkin Rose right here on What on Earth is Happening. We'll be back after these words. Welcome back, everyone. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening here on Oracle Broadcasting. I'm your host, Mark Passio. My website, whatonearthishappening.com. We're talking today with Larken Rose of larkenrose.com. That's LARKENROSE.com. And Larken, I'd like to shift the focus of discussion a bit. We could return to some of the philosophy, but of course that'll be contained in what we talk about. I want to shift focus to some of the forms of media that you have put out there for people to take in that express these ideas. And let's start with some of your videos that you've put out there. One of my favorites was the video called "I'm Allowed to Rob You," which anyone can watch up on YouTube. And I'll also link these with the podcast for today's show when it goes up on the website as a podcast. There's also something out there called "You're Not the Boss of Me," which I highly recommend for people to check out. And one of your more recent ones was called "The Tiny Dot." So if you want to pick one of those and explain what your intentions were for those or what some of these videos contain, go right ahead.
Yeah, the first little YouTube thing I did was "I'm Allowed to Rob You," and I thought I'll just make this short little silly thing, and basically I did the equivalent of what the Constitution did, which is pretend to give someone the right to rob other people. It calls it taxation. It says Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, blah, blah, blah. So I basically just did a silly little video of me doing the same thing, but giving myself the right to rob you, the viewer. And it gets started out with just a scribbled version, and then it gets more and more complicated, more official looking, and just to sort of demonstrate how silly it is to think that any amount of scribbles on paper and rituals and declarations can actually make it okay for somebody to rob somebody else. And I found it was funny because I found that just a simple little video like that got a lot more attention than, when I write some big in-depth philosophical explanation of something, how many people are going to read that? But just that short little video got 60, 70,000 views by now, which is still sort of a drop in the bucket for the population, but that's pretty many people. Just sending it around because it just makes people go, yeah, that is sort of weird. Like, if I can just take little pieces of the belief in statism and just give a little taste of why it doesn't make sense. It doesn't explain everything. It explains almost nothing, in fact. But it just shows one little tidbit of why statism, which we were all raised in, is literally insane. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't match reality. The tiny dot was like that too. It just very simple animation showing the statistical difference between the number of people that claim the right to quote-unquote tax everyone in the country on what they earn and the number of people who are handing over their money because this tiny little speck says you have to give us your money. And just showing the difference in size, it immediately jumps out at you. Why the heck are these people going along with it? And why do they pathetically beg that stupid little dot you can hardly see to let them keep more of their money? And just to show things in these, just, again, little pieces of the puzzle that just make people scratch their heads and go, what? That's weird. Like the tiny dot has over 100,000 views now.
I love the idea in "I'm Allowed to Rob You" it is actually the truth. It's not just an idea that a wrong cannot be transferred to another person and magically become a right. You can't give someone a non-existent right, that you don't have a right to do this to any other living being as an individual. So no amount of people coming together and claiming this right can ever make it moral. It's not a right, it's a wrong. You can't claim that you're allowed to commit a wrong, get a bunch of people to agree with you, sign it into something called legislation, and then magically automatically have inherently this ability to do something wrong that you wouldn't be able to do as an individual. I think this video makes that so clear in such a very concise way. That's what I found so powerful in watching it, and why I think more people should watch it, to try to understand that particular point.
Yeah, and because it really comes down to just, the things that people instinctively know about right and wrong when it comes to their own life. They don't get that their whole belief in government turns it all upside down. Like they would never consider going to their neighbor's house and robbing them at gunpoint to help pay for their kids' education, but they wouldn't bat an eye before voting for somebody who's going to do the exact same thing. And yeah, the video demonstrates, because one of the versions of me trying to give myself the right to rob the viewer is, well, I got some of my friends to sign this one, and they all said I have the right to rob you, as if, and anybody watching it immediately sees, well, that's silly. Your friends can't give you the right to rob me. But it's so obvious, it's so simple that it's almost stupid. But then you realize, well, wait, then how did the Constitution do it? How does democracy do it? How does government do it? None of it makes any sense.
It just shows you how much of a stranglehold this cult, and that's exactly what it is, has on the minds of people, and the things that they have gotten them to believe in that have absolutely no fundamental basis in reality or morality.
Right, and in so many of these instances, the truth is so painfully simple. And the lie is this huge, complex, convoluted, mental gymnastics trying to make the insane sound real. Like, well, they represent us, and like the end of the tiny dot gives his explanation of why this is okay, that there's this tiny little dot robbing all these people, and why they're obligated to do it. And the mythology we're taught, which I memorized and I spouted back and I got good grades, it's utterly insane. Okay, there's this group of people, they rob us, but they're representing us when they rob us and acting on our behalf, and so they somehow have our consent when they rob us. And all these things are blatantly, obviously untrue, but we were all taught to memorize and repeat them. Because if you memorize and repeat something blatantly untrue enough times, you start to imagine that it makes sense. And the challenge here is just to get people to look at some really obvious, simple truths, like you can't delegate a right you don't have. It's just another way to say what you were just saying. And two people can't delegate a right that neither of them have. And just everybody instinctively knows that in their day-to-day lives. But then you say, okay, well then how did Congress get any right to do anything that I can't do myself? And then they go into their sort of mental retreat where they start to spout the bizarre, nonsensical excuses that they were taught growing up, why it's okay for that group to rob somebody else, and why it's not really robbery, and why it's really with our consent. Like, yeah, why do they have all the guns in prisons if it's with our consent? But they spout back the completely nonsensical garbage but you can see it. You can see that it hits them in the head, and they know, yeah, this doesn't make sense, and they freak out and go into literally psychological denial. They don't want to see something that simple that contradicts, a fundamental premise of the way they look at the world.
And so many people are willing to go along with this system to sit on a jury in judgment of other people who have actually committed no actual violent wrongdoing against another living being, and say that they are willing to agree to have them be put in a cage, taken away from their family. I mean, as a personal little anecdote here, a situation just came up within my family where my cousin's husband was just sent away to prison for an interaction between adults that involved substances. And he took a plea bargain so as to avoid a jury trial, which he thought would have gotten him more time because people, would probably find him guilty based on man's law when no other living being was hurt by this voluntary exchange that took place,
Yeah, and their perception, the perception of the jurors and most observers is completely twisted inside out. Because if you said, hey, here's my gun, guy over there, he's smoking pot. Go kick his door down, drag him away, and lock him in your basement for 10 years. They would say, what? Are you crazy? I would never do that. Okay, well then why would you vote for somebody else to do the exact same thing? Why would you sit on a jury and say, yep, I approve of putting that guy in a cage for having a substance or something?
Exactly. Larkin, we're going to pick this up on the other side of the break. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to What on Earth is Happening. My special guest today, Mr. Larkin Rose. We'll be back where we'll talk about some of Larkin's books that he has written. We're back, folks. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening. I'm your host, Mark Passio, and today my special guest is Larkin Rose of larkinrose.com. Before this last break, we were talking about the difference between man's law and moral law, how widely different the laws that people put into effect in society through legislation are than actual morality. Because for there to really be a crime committed, for there to really be a natural law transgression committed, there has to be a harmed individual. There has to be a harmed being. And so many offenses that people go away to prison for, and people are all too ready to put them there for doing just because they believe in the claim of the state. They have actually harmed no one in doing that. They have not actually committed a transgression against someone else's natural law rights. So these are some of the things that Larkin puts forward in some of his videos. So Larkin, you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. Not only do people, they'll sit on a jury and say, hey, the law says you're not allowed to have that substance. They don't even know what they're saying. They literally don't know what they're saying when they say the law. If you ask them, well, what are you talking about? Where did it come from? Well, government. Okay, what the heck is government? Like, what's the origin of this scribble that you think makes it okay to put someone in a cage for having a substance or committing any other victimless, quote-unquote, crime? And eventually they realize, well, it's stuff politicians make up. But they don't talk like that. They talk as if it's, some holy thing descending from on high, the law. Like, who are you? And you can see it in terminology they use on a daily basis. They brag about being a law-abiding taxpayer, and they say, you think you're above the law? And I say, absolutely I'm above the law. Everybody's above the law. It's almost impossible to be below the law if by law you mean the politician scribbles. Because the politician scribbles legitimize way more violence and theft than the vast majority of things that they declare to be crimes. And so the sad part is when there's a jury that says, yeah, we'll say guilty because he got caught with pot, or he got caught, driving without a piece of paper that says he's allowed to, or whatever victimless, quote-unquote, crime, what they don't understand is they're the ones helping the crime. The real crime, when you're talking about natural law, you just put a guy in a cage. That's violence.
Exactly.
But they have their view is so backwards that, and I got a front row seat of this. I got 12 complete state-worshipping buffoons to say I should be in a cage for telling them that they were being defrauded by their own quote-unquote government.
What it really comes down to, Larkin, is they're not even saying you're above the law as if they're trying to say to you, you think that you can do immoral things. They're saying I, as a slave, am talking to the other slaves saying, how dare you think that you're not a slave? That's what they're really saying. They're saying, you think you're above slavery, which is the arbitrary dictates of a psychopath telling other people how they should or should not behave if they're not hurting anybody else. So that's what that person is really saying. They're not openly saying it like you say, they dance around it. But what they're really saying to you is, I'm a happy little slave on the plantation, and I'm saying to another slave who doesn't want to be a slave, how dare you not want to be a slave?
Absolutely. That's absolutely exactly what it is. One of the things I read inside was the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, who was the open, obvious kind of slave that we all call slavery. And he described how a lot of the fellow slaves had that mentality. They believed they were supposed to be slaves, and they viewed a runaway slave as a thief for trying to steal himself from his master, and they would really view them with contempt.
Wow.
And that's exactly America today.
That's about as deep into the mindset of slavery as anybody could possibly get. That's amazing.
And it was really creepy to read, but then it dawned on me, well, of course, like, you know, we would like to think of them as, you know, the slaves as all thinking this is horrible and bad and wrong, and first chance I get, I'm going to run away. But if they thought that, they would have, because, you know, they, even with all the quote-unquote law enforcers making slavery continue, they still outnumbered. They could still outrun them. The problem was they were enslaved inside their own heads just as much or more so than enslaved in body. And if you actually believe that you're supposed to be a slave, and you do if you take pride in being a law-abiding taxpayer, because what that means is I do what the politicians tell me and I give them my money. If you take pride in that, you are taking pride in being the property of politicians. And as long as you have that mentality, you're a slave forever, and you won't be able to understand why anybody else wouldn't be that. And you can see it. I saw it in my own jury. They couldn't fathom how another human being, you know, never mind the legal reasons, would ever not want to pay homage to the master and say, yes, master, here's a bunch of what I earned, and, you know, here's the fruits of my labor, here's a piece of my life. And they literally couldn't imagine how any human being who is good wouldn't bow the way they do. So they said guilty, and I got to be in a cage for a year.
Like you said, it's a complete twisting onto its head of true morality. True morality is actually standing up for your own rights and respecting the boundaries of other people's rights. And what they're saying is you're immoral if you don't want to have your rights transgressed upon by others.
Right. And in my case, what was really frustrating, and I admit I had a hard time not being bitter and angry about it, is what I did. I didn't get, like, caught doing something. I set out to have the trial. I was there to tell those 12 people, you are being defrauded by your own government. And so I was there telling them, you're being victimized by an actual crime, like with a victim, you. And their response, because they've been so indoctrinated into authoritarianism, was, well, you're bad. Like, you're bad for pointing out to us that somebody's robbing us, and for trying to not get robbed yourself. I mean, it's just like, again, in their daily lives, people aren't this insane. It's only when it comes to politics and government. Because, like, if I came out and said, oh, somebody stole my car last week, nobody would think it would be rational for me to then go around to other people and say, I hate you, they didn't steal your car. Like, exactly. That's not a rational response. But that's what Americans think of, quote unquote.
It's like he's not being beaten on as badly as I'm being beaten on, so I need to hate the person who's not being beaten on, not the person who's actually doing the oppression.
Exactly. Why don't you complain about the guy who stole your car instead of complaining about the guy who didn't get his car stolen? But with statist mentality, that's what it does. They literally, you look at what people think of like tax evaders. Take a real case of tax evasion, which mine wasn't, where somebody, they just think, it's my money, I earned it. They didn't. I'm going to hide this over here and sort of lie about that, which is the exact same thing as how do I, I'm driving through a neighborhood. I know there are carjackers here. How do I outsmart them? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly moral and virtuous, but most of the country does the equivalent of how dare you do things to try to make the carjacker not steal your car. And they really think that that is the sin. Tax evasion is the sin of trying to not get robbed. That's so bad that if you try to not get robbed, you should be put in a cage and then robbed.
It's the idea that you're not actually allowed to stand up for rights that you know that you inherently have. If you're not willing to abdicate your rights, that somehow makes you a bad or immoral person. Not the fact that standing up for and refusing to abdicate things that you know are inherent rights actually makes you a more virtuous human being.
Right. But you can see, because the belief in government is a religious belief, you can easily see that in most people's minds, right and wrong is outranked by the will of the politician. Because what they wouldn't do in their personal lives, they will do in political, in the political realm.
Morality, it's not right versus left. It's about right versus wrong. This whole left-right paradigm that people are, you fall in with the left, with the Democrats, or the right, the Republicans, has nothing to do with any of that. It's a false paradigm. The thing that all of that's a distraction for not getting you to pay attention to and understand is the difference, the real, true, and objective difference between right and wrong. And we're going to explore what that is, because it can be known. It can be known, and most people will be shocked and horrified to understand the real differences between right and wrong, because they'll have to look into themselves and recognize in many ways that they are cooperating with wrong, and that they don't really truly know the difference between right and wrong. When you tell a deep understanding of morality, which are the principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong behavior, lies at the very heart of natural law. This is the essence of it, folks, right here. And here's the difference between right and wrong in a nutshell, about as simply as I am capable of describing it. All right? Now, we use the words correct or right to mean correct and moral. When you say, okay, what's 5 plus 5? It's 10. You're right. Meaning you are correct. That is true. That is the correct answer. That is right. Okay? And then we say, was stealing that money from Jim, was that right? To mean, was it a moral behavior? So now, why would we use the same word, again, like the ancient Romans used the same word, book and free? Okay, those two different concepts were represented by the same word, liber, right? And there's a reason, because reading will put you on the path to true freedom if you read the right books. Okay? Why would in the English language, we have other words to mean the same concepts, but the word right means two things simultaneously. It means both correct and it means moral. There's a reason. Because they mean the same thing. Correct is moral. Correct meaning that it is in alignment with that which is true, means literally by definition, if it is true, then it is moral. The more you are following something that is false, that is not based in truth, the more you are going down the path of immorality, of wrongdoing. So we have to come to know what is true regarding right and wrong if we are going to be able to correctly, with wisdom, choose between these two modalities of behavior. So, right, again, it means both correct, which is based in truth, and moral, which means that the action, if taken, if acted upon, is in harmony with natural law. actions based in it do not result in harm to other sentient beings. That's the definition of right. Now look at how simple that definition is. And think about it for a moment. We're talking about what is a right. Meaning, what do you have a right to do? And what you have a right to do is no different than what I have a right to do. What I'm telling you here is every single human being on this planet has the exact same rights. Not one person has one more right than another being. Not one person has one less right than another being. To think that anybody has more or less rights anywhere on the earth at any time in history is a fallacy. It is a lie. It is a deception. It is wrong. It is not correct. It is not based in truth. Rights are universal and the exact same for every human being. Blanket statement, absolute truth. Let the ego chew on it and deal with it. Okay? And again, the ego will have a hard time with this in many cases, with many people. They'll hear that and they'll want to throw a glass at me. So, look at the definition again. A right. So when you make a definition, right, this is a noun. Right? Noun's a person, place, or thing in the English language. We're talking about a noun here. You look up the word right, it's a noun, meaning a right. A right that we have to enact, to take, is an action. You have to start a definition with the same type of word. You're defining a noun, you got to give it a noun to start the definition. A right is an action. Most people will never even be able to tell you that. Just say, could you define what a right is to me? They will not give you this noun. A right is an action. So is a wrong an action. A right is an action that if you take it, it does not cause harm to other sentient beings. That's the simple and easiest definition that anybody can give for what a right is. And I guarantee you, you go and engage as many people as you want on the street. I have not asked this question and had anybody ever raise their hand or even contact me later and say, you go up to somebody on the street and ask them if they could define what a right is. Nobody can give you the correct definition for what a right is. Now, if you don't know what the definition of a right is, you certainly don't know whether you're choosing accurately between a right and a wrong, between right and wrong behavior. You can't. It's not possible. So many people believe that they're allowed and they can do actions with no consequence that actually aren't in alignment with natural law because the taking of those actions do result in harm. And they don't really even understand that. So let's look at what a wrong is. We're going to deeply look into what a wrong is. We're going to focus on what wrongs are. Because in reality, to even start this, right, what have we based this definition on? Actions based in it do not result in harm, right? That's the negative of another definition. Well, it's the negative of this definition. So you can only actually define a right by knowing what a wrong is. A right technically cannot be defined outside of the negative. A right can only be defined apophatically, meaning understanding what a wrong is and then stating that it is anything that falls outside of the parameters of wrongdoing. Okay, and we're going to get to what those parameters are. All right? So, I'm sorry, I want to focus on wrong for a moment. Okay? Wrong, again, we say this, what's 5 plus 5? 9. Wrong, it's not true. Incorrect. Incorrect answer. It's not based in truth. We use the term wrong to mean both incorrect and immoral. Well, that was wrong what you did to that person by hitting him for no reason. You didn't have the right to do that. Immoral means in opposition to natural law. Because actions that are based in it result in harm to other sentient beings. That's the simple definition of a wrong. Now we can go deeper into the definition of what a wrong is and look at different types of wrongs, which is what I'm going to do in a moment. So this is the concept that is referred to as apophatic inquiry. Very, very critical to understand concept. And you have to apply this concept. What this essentially is it's a filtration process. This is the process of the middle process in the trivium, okay? It's weeding through the inconsistencies and saying, well, is this inconsistent? Is this inconsistent? Is that not true? And you're setting those behaviors aside, and you're saying, here's the behaviors that are wrong. Don't engage in those behaviors. It's negative. It's a negative process. It's a destructive process. You're taking away from the body of everything that can be done, and you're saying, I'm pulling all of these out through a weeding down process and saying, these are all inconsistent with truth. It's called apophasis, apophatic inquiry. And that is to be delineated from what's known as cataphatic inquiry. Cataphatic inquiry means you're reasoning in the affirmative, and you're not trying to weed down through a process of elimination to get to the truth. Okay, so cataphasis or cataphatic inquiry would be equivalent to inductive reasoning, whereas apophatic inquiry or apophasis would be akin to deductive reasoning. All right? Rights are most easily understood when they are considered through apophatic inquiry, or what is known as the process of apophasis. This process helps us to understand what a right actually is by understanding which actions are not rights because they cause harm to others. They're the cause of harm. Here's what apophasis is. It's been called apophatic inquiry. Okay? Really look this up. Understand what apophasis is because it's part of the trivium process. All right? It comes from the Greek noun apophasis, written there in Greek script, which comes from the Greek verb apophanai. Okay, so apo in Greek means away from or the negation of, and phanai in Greek means to say or to speak. So when we put them together, it means to say no or not to say, or to say what something is not, in other words. That's what apophasis is. You're saying this is not this. It's the opposite of that. Okay? So it is a method of logical reasoning or deductive reasoning that is employed when you are given a limited set of possibilities in order to arrive at knowledge by way of the exclusion of known negatives. You're setting the logical inconsistencies to the side and saying, this is not what this thing is. That's called apophasis. Okay? You are describing what something is by explaining what it is not. This is called affirmation through negation, is another term that this truth discovery process is known as. Okay? So, what we're going to do is apophasis. We're going to do apophatic inquiry regarding right and wrong. So, what is not a right? What are ways that people can cause harm to other people or animals? Ways that we can cause harm to other sentient beings. One of the first thing, so what we're doing here is we're going to list the boundary conditions for natural law here, for breaking natural law. If we take these actions, we are breaking natural law because the action is a cause which results in the effect of harm to another being. All right? So these are what are simply, I call them the natural law transgressions, which means sins or wrongdoings. They're simply harmful actions that a person is capable of taking to another being, against another being. That's all. So of course, many people will get the first one. What's one of the main horrible, wrong things that somebody can do to another person? Kill them. Murder them. Take their life. Okay? Murder. And I would distinguish murder from killing as well. Because occasionally, to defend oneself, killing may be necessary. But murder is always immoral and wrong. Okay? See, the fifth commandment in Hebrew, do you know what it says in Hebrew? It does not say thou shalt not kill. The term for murder in Hebrew is tirzach. The fifth commandment in Hebrew is lo tirzach, which means do not murder. Murder, as a verb in Hebrew, is a completely different word and a totally different connotation than the verb to kill. Because what they're saying is, don't take life without any right to take it. Meaning that you initiated the violence. And that's what murder is. It's the initiation of the taking of somebody else's life when you had absolutely no right to take that life. Now, if someone is coming after you, your rights, there may be times when you do have to take defensive action and forceful action, up to and including deadly force. We're going to talk about that later. But murder is the first natural law transgression. And if you want to go down to a subsection of this transgression, you could list it as a totally separate wrongdoing. I'm keeping it in the same basic category. Assault, meaning you're directly physically accosting without right the well-being, the bodily well-being of another being, is also, it's like, it would be, you could consider it attempted murder. Because assault is something that you do without right. If someone assaults somebody, they have no right to commit assault. Never exists. The right to commit assault does not exist. The right to commit murder does not exist in any circumstance, ever. Blanket statement. The right to defend oneself through physical force exists, and possibly in certain circumstances, the right to kill exists. But murder and assault can never be rights, because they always are done by being initiated without the right to do so. It is the initiation of violence. All right? Rape is the second natural law transgression. Okay? You're coercing the free will of another person and making them sexually associate with whom they wish not to. That's rape. And it's always wrong. Blanket statement. All right? The third natural law transgression is theft. It is the taking of property that does not belong to you. Someone else, got that property through lawful means without hurting somebody else. That's their property for as long as they are using it and being responsible for it. And you don't have a right to just take what doesn't belong to you. Nobody has a right to take my projector or my remote control or my computer any more than I would have the right to take Richard's cameras. Okay? It would be theft of somebody else's property. It's not mine. And this is the problem. We don't understand property. As we're going to get to, all rights are property rights. We'll get to that in a moment. That's the third natural law transgression. The fourth is trespass. And that means going into somebody else's lair that they are using, that they own lawfully and that they're responsible for, without their permission or consent, and you're just invading their privacy and their space, and you're taking their security away from them in that process. And we do have a right to set aside a place for ourselves for our own lair. Okay? And to violate that is to trespass against somebody else in their own property. The fifth and last natural law transgression is coercion. This is forcing somebody through the threat of violence to have their will comply with your will, whether they don't wish that to be the case or not. Making somebody do something that is against their will. Coercing them. And that's also not a right. Now, that's a small list. Very small list, right? We could add one more. We could add lying. Lying is also a wrongdoing. And I would consider that a theft of truth or a withholding of truth that somebody needs to understand to make accurate and informed decisions, lying to them. Okay? But essentially, these five are the overarching natural law transgressions. I challenge anybody to come up with a wrongdoing that doesn't fit into one of these categories. So far, I've never had one person able to do it. Any wrongdoing, any action that you could think of that doesn't fall into one of these wrongdoings. Yep. I would probably categorize it as pure ignorance, but I would say, hey, maybe you could look at it like that, because that's propagating the slavery system indirectly. So, you're actually, you're not doing anything to help anybody else's freedom, certainly. I don't know if I would categorize that as a natural law transgression, because, it's giving consent and propping up that system. It's not technically what I would call an action, but It's more of like giving consent. Hey, you could say that is a wrongdoing, I guess, because giving your consent is tacitly saying yes to control, and that's ultimately affecting everybody else's freedom negatively. So, possibly. But in general, what I would say is, if you could think of an actual physical action that doesn't fall into one of those categories, let me know, because that's a pretty comprehensive list, and it's only like 6 words. So. Now, what if I told you I could narrow it down? What if I told you I can get rid of 5 of those words and take it down to 1? Okay? These are the wrongdoings. Let's try to narrow it down, right? Okay? Every harmful action that a human being is capable of taking is a form of theft. Now, many people will hear that for the first time. I've never heard that said. There is no action that you can take that causes harm to another person that is not a form of theft in some form or fashion. I challenge anybody to come up with an action that isn't a form of theft, an action that is a wrongdoing that isn't a form of theft. You won't be able to do it. I put that challenge out on my podcast. Say, email me if you know. No, not one person. The only one person challenged it and tried to say lying. I say, okay, that's really taking the truth from somebody, thieving truth. And whether you want to look at it as you're simply dissuading them from looking at the truth too, deceiving them or not offering correct information, still you're taking away their ability to make correct judgments based on the availability of information. So it is a form of theft. Some form of property. Now look at that word. Property. Proper. Meaning right, is always being stolen when a wrongdoing is committed. All rights are property rights. All wrongs are theft of property. Once again, I challenge anybody. It's an open challenge. If you can find me a right that is not a property right, or a wrong that is not the theft of some form of property, please do it. Please let me know. Okay? Life is a form of property. So taking life you had no right to take, murder, is stealing property that wasn't your own, because that was that person's life, possessive. They own it. And I didn't have a right to just go and take it for no reason. Rights are a form of property, meaning actions that you may do because they are in harmony with natural law and do not cause harm to others. I don't have a right to stop you from taking. If you're not harming somebody else, nobody has a right to stop you from taking an action. You may perform any action which does not directly result in harm to somebody else. Okay? Rights are a form of property. Freedom is a form of property. Somebody doesn't have a right to take somebody else's freedom and hold them against their will just because they don't like what they're doing. They have a distaste for what they're doing. Or they want them to comply with their behavior, with their commands. Okay? They want them to make their behavior comply with commands that they're being given. So, if you really break it down, let's look at the wrongdoings once again. Murder. Is that not the taking of somebody else's life? Assault is the taking of their right to remain unharmed in their person. You're taking their health if you assault them, right? Their homeostasis in their body is being put under assault. And that's robbery. That's somebody taking something that isn't theirs to take. Rape. You're taking somebody else's free will to sexually associate with whom they choose to sexually associate. And therefore that's a property theft, because that's their property, their free will. Theft itself says it right there. You're taking physical possessions that aren't yours to take from somebody else. Stealing. Trespass. You are taking someone's security in their own lair, as we talked about, which you don't have a right to take. That's also their property. Coercion. What are you taking? Somebody else's free will, which isn't yours to take. That's a gift from the Creator, which belongs to each individual. And if somebody's coercing somebody by telling them, you must do this because I said so, and if you don't do this, I will come and do some form of harm to you, that's not a right. That's a wrongdoing, coercion. And it's a form of theft. Exactly. Sure. You must buy this. Imagine this. Great. We're going to take 5 more minutes, and then we're going to take an hour and 15-minute break. So all of these things are forms of wrongdoing, and they're all ultimately one wrongdoing in different forms. They are all theft, every one of them. There is only one wrongdoing. There's only one way anybody can wrong anybody else. Stealing. That's it. Every form of wrongdoing is a form of theft against another being and their property. A living being or their property must have been harmed in order for a violation of natural law or wrongdoing to have taken place. Any action which does not cause such harm is a right. There's the apophatic definition of a right. Through understanding what a wrongdoing is. And I'm telling you, billions of people, not millions, not hundreds of millions, billions of people on this planet do not know this. Could not tell you this. Because this is it. This is it, folks, right here. This is the crux of natural law. What is a right? What is a wrong? And I couldn't sleep last night. After we got home, and I never have problems sleeping. Ever. Ever. I'm just going to tell you this before we break. I was laying in bed last night before I went to sleep for the night. Could not sleep because all I was thinking of is how preposterous. I told this to some people at lunch. I'm just sitting there thinking about how preposterous and ridiculous it is for me to even ever have to utter any of this. The fact that this is not 100% pure common sense knowledge on the earth is so abominably preposterous to me that all I was sitting there thinking is, how could I be going out and explaining this to people? This is what I must do? Me, though. It was almost like schizophrenic in a way. Because I was just thinking, I was waking up and then falling back to sleep and waking up thinking, where am I? Why am I here? And I'm the person who's coming out and doing this. And it's just so absurd and ridiculous to me. Some punk from South Philadelphia taking in the knowledge of the mystery traditions and teaching them to people. Me. It's the most ridiculous thing. I can't even imagine it, you know? I still can't. I can't imagine that it's necessary, you know? That's the position that our society is in. It's so profoundly sad that I can't believe it. And unless we deeply start to understand this and propagate this knowledge to other people, things are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And there's no reason for it. There's no reason to go down that path. We want to choose the way of maximum pain because we don't want to give up thoughts that we're addicted to just because the pattern has been there for as long as we can remember. We would rather go down the path to the grave and the abyss rather than admit we were wrong and just say, I need to give up this negative way of thinking. You know? I'm going to leave it right there and just say the bottom line to what this section comes down to is if someone hasn't been harmed, no wrongdoing has been committed. No victim, no crime, in other words. Many people insist, there doesn't have to be a victim for there to be a crime committed. You know how many people are rotting away in a jail cell right now as we speak who have never harmed another living being? You know how many people? Tens of thousands. Okay? And no one has any right to hold them. Unless you've harmed somebody else, nobody has a right to stop you from continuing to take the action that you are taking. The concept that if there is no victim, if no actual wrongdoing has taken place resulting in harm to someone else, there is no crime. And many people are, being jailed for victimless crimes that they've never harmed another being, and yet their freedom has been taken away. Another aspect about this concept of the difference between right and wrong behavior is we have to understand that there is no such thing as the ability to delegate a wrong to someone else. No one can say to someone, you may harm him unchallenged or unaccosted, okay? That you're allowed to do that morally, okay? No more than anybody can say a group of people may commit a wrongdoing and they have the moral right to commit it, to commit that wrongdoing. There's no such thing as that. Okay? So this is what many people who believe in things like government believe in, that we can delegate to a group of people who are calling themselves a government something that is not a right, and agree, all come together and agree upon, they now possess this right. Rights can't be granted by human beings to other human beings. Everybody is born with the same rights because rights don't come from human beings. Rights, like the laws of nature, come from the creator of the universe. They don't come from human beings. Human beings don't make up what right and wrong are. Right and wrong are inherent to creation and are up to us to discover and recognize what they are and then live in accordance with those principles. So if a specific action is not a right for any individual, that action cannot be, quote, delegated, granted, or licensed to any other individual or group and magically called a right. It does not become a right. If it's wrong, it remains a wrong, no matter how many people believe they can do it or delegate it or otherwise. Similarly, a right can't be turned into a wrong. If it's a right and you're not harming somebody by doing it, somebody can't magically say, well, that's a wrong and you're not allowed to do that. And yet we have things that go right hand in hand with that, and it's called government. An action that is a wrong would forever remain a wrong under natural law. So how do we know what rights are? Part of knowing rights is understand that natural law, the difference between right and wrong, always holds true regardless of a population's belief system. Like natural law being in effect, the difference between right and wrong are not dependent on anybody's belief. They are eternal truths that need to be understood. So this means it does not matter how many people agree that a wrong can be turned into a right or that a right can be turned into a wrong. Such things can never be done in reality. We can believe we can do that and act like that, but in reality, it cannot actually be done. A right forever remains a right, a wrong forever remains a wrong. People can only believe that they can claim such reversals and that this will magically make it so. Unfortunately, most human beings erroneously believe that it is morally possible for them to create and delegate rights, quote unquote, which do not exist, or to take away actual rights from people which do exist. They believe we can do that. So when in doubt as to whether an action is or is not in harmony with natural law, the visualization exercise that I always ask people to do is to imagine a scenario of a planet, a world, where there is only two people, where only two people exist on an entire planet, okay? If the behavior in that circumstance, in that visualized instance, is either a right or a wrong, in that instance, it remains a right or a wrong in any size population, regardless of how many people may believe otherwise. Okay? So if a right is a right for one person to do toward another, okay, or if it's a wrong, the action is a wrong for one person to take toward another, population is irrelevant. People will say, well, yeah, if there was a couple of people, that would be okay. But if in a world of 7 billion people, we can't let people do that. Well, this has nothing to do with what right and wrong is. You know, as if they're changeable. Let's look at this scenario. So what's the one true divide that exists in humanity? People say, oh, this is separation talk. We're all one. No, we're not. There is one true divide that does exist in reality. And here's what it is. The one true divide that separates humanity into two distinct types of individuals. The criteria for this divide is whether or not an individual believes in, quote, authority, and therefore believes that there is legitimacy to slavery. The two groups of people are the people who know slavery is never legitimate and people who believe that it can be legitimate. That's what actually separates humanity. See, all the other things, divide and conquer. Race, religion, sexuality, income, religious belief systems. These are all divide and conquer techniques. There's one real difference, whether somebody believes in slavery or not. And of course, people have called this difference statists. and anarchists, right? So a statist is an individual who erroneously believes there's such a thing as authority that is vested in certain human beings, magically giving them the right to rule over other people. This authority means that certain people who we call government have the, quote, moral right to issue commands to those whom they rule, those under their jurisdiction, and that their subjects or slaves have a, quote, moral obligation to obey the arbitrary dictates or laws, quote unquote, that are set by their masters. Most simply put, a statist is nothing more than someone who believes in the legitimacy of slavery. Conversely, an anarchist, a true anarchist anyway, is one who knows that there could never be legitimacy to authority or government, because those terms are simply euphemisms for violence and slavery and coercion, which are always immoral and in opposition to natural law. Let's look at what the word anarchy really means. Again, you got to break it down. From the Greek prefix an, which means without or the absence of, and the Greek noun archon, they're written in Greek script, which means master or ruler. And again, I mean externally. One who externally rules another or claims to be the master of another. That's what the term archon means in its connotation. Anarchy, as we can see by putting these together, does not mean without rules. The word archon does not mean rules. Okay? Because there's always going to be rules in effect called natural law, the laws of morality. It means rulers, imposed rulers. That's what archon means in Greek. It literally means anarchy now, putting it together. An, absence of, archon, master or ruler. The absence of masters or rulers. Externally imposed masters or rulers. Meaning, when we put it together, okay, it means without rulers, without masters. Now, if you give people that term, no masters, no rulers, no masters, no slaves, what word are they going to associate those phrases with? Freedom. But if you tell people what does anarchy mean to you, what do you associate it with, what are they going to tell you? Chaos, which is the exact opposite. That's in that other column. Okay? They have deliberately obfuscated the meaning of the word through a mind control technique called endless repetition. If I could keep telling you a word doesn't mean what it means, that's not a projector, that's a hammer. Hey, could you check out my hammer over there and make sure it's projecting the image on the board correctly? You know, the bulb burned out in my hammer. I might need to go buy a new hammer. If I kept doing that endlessly for years and years and years, people would start calling that device a hammer. If I got enough people to keep calling it that. So they've gotten enough people to call freedom chaos. Think about that. They've gotten enough people to believe that the absence of the state of slavery means chaos instead of freedom. It's almost unfathomable. It's almost incomprehensible. The mind job that's been done on this species. It's almost incomprehensible. Anarchy is the state of existence where there are no masters and no slaves. Therefore, what it really means is the absence of slavery, or in other words, true freedom. That's all it means. I prefer to call it anarchony, okay? Keeping the entire word archon instead of taking out the O-N, okay? If we keep that there and call it anarchony, and I say I'm an anarchonist, people will ask, well, what the hell is that? And then you could really break the word down and say the absence of archons, the absence of those who would claim to be masters over a population of slaves. That's what an anarchonist is. It's saying that's illegitimate, that's unnecessary, and that we need to do away with that state of existence.
Hey, Larkin Rose here, and I want to talk to you about those fringe extremists that you may be seeing on the news, those anti-government radicals and enemies of our republic and people trying to destroy democracy and all that fun stuff. And I wanted to make this video to point out that those people are none of those things. Now, you may be assuming that I'm making this video to defend them from these accusations. No, I'm not. I'm making this video to defend me and people who believe as I do, because we don't want to be associated with those boot-licking, politician-worshipping doofuses that are everything except what the media is pretending they are. So let's run down the list, shall we? Anti-government. If somebody is having a tantrum and a protest and a riot and a whatever you want to classify it as, demanding that their politician be put into power to rule over everybody and take your money and control your choices, that's not anti-government. They just want a slightly different flavor of authoritarian collectivism as compared to the flavor that most of the mainstream news wants. There's no real fundamental difference. I, on the other hand, am actually anti-government because I understand that government is inherently coercive and violent. It's inherently immoral. They will pretend that, well, government is just how we all get along and how we organize and cooperate. No, it isn't. Government, by its very nature, is a coercive, authoritarian ruling class. What it does is boss you around and take your money and spend it on things that you wouldn't spend it on if you had the choice. I am against that, which means I am against government, because government is always that. It is always a violator of individual rights. I don't like that. That's what makes me anti-government. So when you see either the Proud Boys and the Trumpites whining that their tyrant didn't get into power and a different tyrant got into power instead, they're not anti-government. And when you see protests with Antifa whining that we need more government handouts and more leftists in office, they're not anti-government either. Both of those are just two sets of government-worshipping dupes bickering over which jackboot they want on their throat. As someone who is genuinely anti-government, I'm offended that you're pretending that they have anything to do with what I believe. I don't run around burning down people's properties because I believe in private property, which is why I oppose government, because government is always the biggest violator of individual rights, the biggest violator of property rights, the biggest thief in the world. So when somebody goes anarchy and goes around burning down random properties and demanding government handouts, they don't even know what the word anarchy means. Anarchy means without rulers, without a ruling class, without government. When they're whining for a slightly different flavor of government, they're not anarchists. They might think they are, or they might be instigators or whatever, but when the media pretends that they are anti-government, that's ridiculous. So, I'm anti-government, they're not. Please stop calling them anti-government. It's insulting to me and others like me who believe in actual freedom and self-ownership and non-aggression and voluntarism, a stateless society where we're all actually equals and none of us votes for a big political parasite to violently impose our will on other people. So, they're not anti-government, I'm anti-government. They're not enemies of democracy. They're just bickering over who won the game of democracy. I am an enemy of democracy because democracy is a majority voting to violate the rights of a minority, whether it's racial minority or just population minority or we want to impose our will on you. Well, we want to impose our will on you. I am against that because majority initiating violence doesn't make it any better. It doesn't make it any more moral. Each individual owns himself, and it's not okay for the majority to commit aggression against any minority, down to one person. That's the ultimate minority, one person. If everyone in the country says, we really want that one person forced to pay for something he doesn't want, I am against that because I am against democracy. Because democracy is not freedom, and democracy is not good, and it's not moral. It is the best excuse tyrants have ever come up with for violent coercion and authoritarian domination. Oh, we're doing this in the name of the people. Look up all of the worst tyrants in history. They all said that. Mao said it. Stalin said it. Hitler said it. Pol Pot. Right down the list. They all pretended that the violence they inflicted on the minority was in the name of the collective and the common good and the people and the majority, and that makes it okay. No, it stinking doesn't. I am an enemy of democracy because democracy is an enemy of morality and an enemy of freedom. So don't pretend people bickering over which tyrant they want in power are against democracy. They're not. They're just bickering over who they want to win that stupid, inherently immoral game. I'm anti-democracy. I'm also an enemy of the state, because the state is inherently an enemy of humanity and morality, because what it does is boss people around and steal their money and violently control their choices. I am opposed to that, which makes me an enemy of the state. Let's see. I'm also an extremist. Now, that word is kind of loaded and stupid, because all extreme means is if there's a range of possibilities, you're like all the way over here or you're all the way over here. For example, when it comes to kicking puppies, I'm an extremist because I don't want anybody to kick puppies. Sorry if that's not moderate enough for you, if I'm not progressive and enlightened enough to advocate some puppy kicking. I'm all the way at the extreme end of that, where I don't want anybody kicking puppies. Now, the other end would be the extreme end of everybody should constantly be kicking puppies. The idea that the extremes are inherently wrong and somewhere in the middle is right is just profoundly stupid. In political terms, I am absolutely an extremist because I want zero violent coercion. I want zero legalized extortion and domination. I want zero warmongering. I want zero authoritarian subjugation of humanity. So along the spectrum of stupid political ideas there are, I am extreme because I'm all the way at the end that says I don't want an authoritarian ruling class violating the rights of anybody. And in one sense, that makes me an extremist because almost everybody else, the vast majority of the population, is bickering over who they want dominated and robbed and how much. Republicans want these people robbed a little bit more than these people, and Democrats want these people robbed a little more than these people. They are all advocates of robbery. They are moderates. They are progressives. They are reasonably within the limit, within the normal limits and the spectrum of ideas inside an inherently immoral and insane idea, which is politics and government. Whereas I am at the fringe extreme that says, I don't want anybody ruling you or anybody else. Not ruling me, not ruling you, not ruling anybody else. If you're not using fraud or violence against somebody else, I don't want anybody sticking their nose into your life and trying to control your choices. I want you to be absolutely free as long as you aren't being an aggressor against somebody else. Now, if you are, then anybody has the right to defend that person. They can defend themselves or somebody else can defend them. People have the right to defend against an aggressor. And you don't need a special badge or legislation or any of that nonsense to have the right to defend against an aggressor. It's inherently justified to defend against an attacker. It's inherently immoral to be an attacker. And since government is always an attacker, even if sometimes it goes after other attackers, it's always the biggest thug and thief on the block. It is therefore inherently immoral. That is why I am 100% against it, which on the political spectrum puts me at extreme fringe, zero extortion, zero puppy kicking, zero warmongering. That is what I believe in. I am actually an extremist on the inherently bogus spectrum of political ideas. So feel free to call me an extremist. Feel free to call me anti-government and anti-democracy and anti-republic. They're trying to destroy our constitutional republic. Look up in the history books, all of the most tyrannical regimes in the history of the world were constitutional republics, were democratically elected constitutional republics that had a constitution which included a Bill of Rights. They didn't all call it that because most of them were other languages, but they were all that. So no, it doesn't make you great and learned and wise to believe in a constitutional republic. The Soviet Union was a constitutional republic, democratically elected with a Bill of Rights. Communist China was a democratically elected constitutional republic with a Bill of Rights. Of course, Bill of Rights didn't do any good. People got stomped on anyway, just like they get stomped on here, despite the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution. But you're not allowed to. But they do anyway. Why? Because that's what government does. That's why some of us have figured out that to be pro-humanity, you have to be anti-government. So I am anti-democracy, anti-republic. I'm a fringe extremist. I'm an anarchist because that means I don't want anyone ruling you or me or anybody else. Doesn't mean I run around throwing Molotov cocktails. It means I actually believe in equality and freedom, that I believe everybody should be left to do whatever they want as long as they're not committing aggression or fraud against somebody else. You do whatever you want. It's your life. You get to run it. Now, the people who believe in politics pretend to believe that, but no, they don't, because then they turn around and vote for people who they know damn well are going to pass and enforce laws restricting your choices, not just laws against don't steal and don't murder people, but laws against a billion things that you haven't even read 1% of the laws that are out there, and neither have I. Controlling all manner of choices that they have no business controlling. I am against that, which makes me anti-government. So, yeah, please stop insulting me by calling the Proud Boys or Antifa anti-government, because no, they're not. Or anti-democracy, because no, they're not. Or anti-republic, because no, they're not. Enemies of the state. No, they're not. They're a bunch of bootlickers who just want the state using its violence for their interests at the expense of somebody else. By the way, if you vote, that's you too. You are just trying to get someone into power or a party into power who will use the violence of the state, the force of law, in a way that you think will benefit you at the expense of somebody else's freedom and property and freedom to choose for themselves how to live their lives. That makes you an enemy of humanity. I am absolutely an enemy of government because government is the enemy of humanity by its very nature. There is not and cannot be a government which just protects individual rights. If there were an organization that did that, it wouldn't be government by any sane definition. It couldn't tax, it couldn't legislate, it wouldn't have any jurisdiction, it wouldn't have any monopoly on anything. It would be some people deciding to protect some other people. I'm all in favor of that. I'm all in favor of cooperation and organization. What I am not in favor of, and the thing which makes government government, is the idea that certain people have special rights. Or to put it another way, that certain people have an exemption from morality. They're allowed to rob you if they call it taxation. They're allowed to violently limit your peaceful choices if they call it law and legislation and regulation. No, they're not. Humanity is the arch enemy of government. Government is the arch enemy of humanity, which is why I am and will always be anti-government. Please stop pointing to a bunch of boot-licking, power-happy authoritarian collectivists and calling them anti-government, because they're not. Now, if you want to learn why being anti-government is the only moral stance, is the only sane political stance, it's actually anti-political because it's giving up the entire game of politics as inherently bogus, then Google voluntarism, or you can read my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, and you too may soon be saying proudly and loudly, I am anti-government.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. An entitlement is a birthright that we have as a result of our being born into creation from the universe. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, in other words, common sense knowledge, that all men are created equal under universal law. Under natural law, we are equal. We are not all the same in our capabilities and our attributes and characteristics, but we are all equal under natural law, meaning that as one person has rights, everyone has rights. Rights are the same for all, and rights should not be violated for any. Okay? No one has special rights to violate other people's rights. This is what being created equal means. and that they are endowed, an endowment, again, a birthright of creation, by their creator with certain unalienable rights, rights which are inherent to creation and can never be separated from the sovereign individual. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unfortunately, they left out property. I have to laugh at all the infighting between all the anarchist factions. It gives me a chuckle, okay? Because all anarchy means is no masters, no slaves, no rulers. Yeah, we have all these different variations and breakdowns, and here's why. All of them want something different for themselves, for personal reasons. They don't want alignment with natural law because it's the right way to behave. It's the right way to think, feel, and behave. They want things for themselves. So you have, the capitalists saying, I want more Bitcoin, the communists, I want free stuff, I want to smash the patriarchy, I want to destroy cis scum, I want to destroy technology. All these different anarcho-factions. There's only one real form of anarchy. It's true freedom based in right action under natural law. Is the only real anarchy that is and ever will be. These are all just more dialectics to divide and conquer people.
What we have here is the simple nature of government. This is a very simple diagram to sort of give a perspective on the view of Minarchism and its contrast anarchism. So we are going to look at the two, and everything that has to do with this diagram is actually rather simple. So let's start with looking at the middle, the circle in the square. So the square, first of all, let's define what the square is. It says it on the top left-hand corner. It says it is rigid. It is brain imbalance. It is construct and constriction. If you know anything about the archetype of a square, it is something that is rigid because of those angles. It's very, very solid, stuck in its ways, and that's why a brain imbalance would constitute such. Because if you are too left brain or too right brain, you may be prone to mind control or prone to certain ways of thinking that will become hard if opposed information comes into your view. You will not want to see it. You may have cognitive dissonance. And so that square represents that constriction, but also the construction, something that man perhaps has created, a limit on self, may you see. So then we have other rectangles, other squares within that one square in the center, and that can be seen as states within a country. Okay, so the big square is the country, the small squares is the states, or it could be seen as many different things. You may even have multiple different squares resembling multiple different countries. It may be seen as simply bricks within the pyramid structure, for which every government is a hierarchy. So that's why there's a pyramid symbol on there. And so it is rigid, and these governments, the big ones, tend to form new ones over time as revolutions occur, and the small ones become big ones as inevitable by the nature of Minarchism as described in this video that you are watching. And so that's what you can see by the arrows that are contracting and expanding near the rectangles. So it's to say that any big government is soon going to become a small government, and any small government is soon going to become a big government. This is well represented by the Tytler cycle, and the cycle of government is usually around 200 to 300 years, typically, according to his estimations. However, of course, the best government would be that of one that represents nature at most, right? One that people, their nature, can abide to the best. And you have to question if that's possible. Well, by natural law and by study of anarchy and what freedom is and what our natural rights are, we see that's self-evident that it cannot be true. So this square, if I were to expand the square even more and more and more, it would not fulfill the size of the circle. There will always be leftover room, so it cannot fulfill the truth. It is not holistic, as it claims to be, perhaps, and so it is doomed to fail in which way, some way, shape, or form somehow. It's not aligned with truth. It seeks to perhaps be truth and give off the illusion that it can be, especially through the ideology of a one-world government or promised change and dependency. But by nature of any government system, it is doomed to fail. It is doomed to result in democide or mass harm, and there becomes a lot of problems present. Okay, and what I want to do is reduce harm done to the world. How do we do that? We recognize truth. We recognize that we own ourselves. So that is escaping those boundaries, those borders, getting past the borders, realizing we all live on Earth, so we're not in the square anymore, and getting past the square, we get into the circle. So we see nature. We see the whole. That is nature, which is also the anarchy. Because anarchy is simply freedom, and archon means no rulers, no masters, and thus, because there's no masters, there's no slaves. Everyone is equal, truly equal. And so, you will not have such in any government that, again, the nature thereof is a hierarchy. It cannot have such holistic circle completeness. So if I were to stand in a circle with people, I am simply one of them. If we were to stand in a pyramid structure, well, people are below me. And now I have to rule over them, and I have the supreme, somewhere gained, presumed right to rule over them, which I never had in nature. So waking up to this square, or this government, is waking up to nature, freedom, truth, anarchy. And that's what it says, self-evident conscious truth. It is self-evident that you own yourself. It is self-evident that nobody should rule over your life. But coming to that realization may not be easy, especially when you're stuck in those boundaries of the squares. And so those squares can increase or decrease in size, but it won't matter because you're still in a square. And that tells you that Minarchism, as it says in the left center, it says Minarchism is still statism, aka archonism, masterism. Okay, so it believes that in authority. Statism is the belief in authority. It is what creates government, as it says at the top. It is belief in authority, mental construct, because you believe something that doesn't actually exist. There's a video I did, 144 proofs government should not and does not exist. I would recommend checking that out in case you're interested. And so, because it is constructed by man, it is fake. It is not actually true in nature. It is based purely on belief. It also constricts the mind, because there's a difference between believing in something and knowing in something. What you believe is irrelevant to what the truth says. Truth doesn't rely on your belief. Truth doesn't care about your feelings. And so it says the mental construct or constriction, aka denaturalization. You're becoming detached from nature because you believe there's a state over your life that runs your life instead. So instead of nature or God running your life, you instead have this superficial, presumed leader who you looked up to, similar to, as a god, and you believe in them. So that is why it's often considered a religion. And religion, as in religare, means to bind. So there we see also the resemblance of the square, where we are held back and we are restricted from forward progress, which is what religare means, the Latin definition of religion, at least one of the main ones. So then we see here government actually means mind control. In Latin it does, govano mentis, and it says mind control away from nature, so bringing us from this circle that we are innately, we are a circle, right, as above so below, the principle of correspondence. We have this circle. May you see it as yourself. That's not on this graph. That is simply within the square or the circle. You get to choose, right, where you want to be here. And obviously you belong in nature because the square is in the circle, but realizing that you are part of nature gets you out of that square and keeps you in the circle where you belong. So it keeps you in nature, keeps you in freedom. And so that is knowledge, right, of nature. It's recognition of knowledge that is innate, the self-evident conscious truth, as it says. So government is mind control away from nature, and knowledge, which comes from nature, where else would it be? Nature is the best teacher, but the knowledge of natural law, natural rights, those aspects are part of nature. To know that you own yourself, to know that only you are responsible for your own actions. Okay? So the circle, it says, is holistic, whole balance. It is awakening, but also possibility, because do not forget, with freedom comes possibility. So only once you escape that square and you see the possibility that you can, you automatically are waking up to this circle, the whole of life. You're starting to see all the truths that are present, not just some. And so it says near the bottom left-hand side of the diagram, internal or external, country or state or individual. These are different interpretations that could be made thereof: the square, the internal circle that is you, and the big circle that is the whole diagram. Okay, so internal, external, that can do with the states or the countries external from one another, and it could do with the individual that is internal within the state or external, leaving it and opposing the will that is being imposed on them. Right? So it is understanding the internal external relationships. That is what this diagram represents. And so again, the square cannot fulfill or complete the circle. So no matter how big or small you make government, it's not going to matter. The circle is the holistic picture of life that cannot be replaced, and its size cannot be underestimated either, for it is on paper here, but of course it is just a depiction of a greater idea. Now, a similar depiction to this diagram you may see is called the One Ultimate Agenda Schism. It's another diagram that I made. It's also found on my docu-series on Nita.1/perspective. And escaping the square to circle is possible, it says. So you have to know it is possible first, right? You have to recognize that you do have freedom, that you do live within nature. These recognitions help you escape those boundaries, so you can wake up to the true reality of nature. And the circle is that intended form, that holistic form. You are to be holistic. That is the goal of life, is to live healthy, to live happy. So to not have brain imbalances, but to find balance, to live content. These are goals. And hopefully by fulfilling this through your actions, through your belief, through your knowledge, your belief, perhaps as your perception aligned with the knowledge, you can achieve what you want to achieve. And so this is the simple nature of government and how it restricts those possibilities, of how it is by its nature restriction in nature. Now, one really important part, and you're going to see some other graphs I believe here, this one is called the Tytler cycle, something I believe invented by a Scottish professor, Alexander Tytler, and it talks about this around 200-year cycle of how you see government starts to keep creating. So our job here is to understand this cycle and see that what would happen if we just keep falling to the hands of statism. If we keep falling to the hands of statism, we have this continuous cycle where, although there may be a shift to, okay, let's change the government back to good again. Oh, it gets bad, now we got to shift it to good again. Oh, it gets bad, we shift it to good again. There's no sustainable model. There's no long-term, generational, sustainable model that works through all the generations. And the problem here, the biggest reason why our mission in this movement is designed to work in its nature, naturally, is because if you look at the very top of this cycle, bondage to faith to courage, that particular area involves harm. You know, where you have this, it's actually, the harm is more dependence and apathy. Right there is the harm, and that's where the people start to oppose the conditions, as it says. So people start to oppose it around there, and then it sometimes can cause a little bit more harm from bondage to faith. But that's when people start moving things back in the right direction. Now that's the same direction we'll do when we initiate the movement, but there's going to be a different cycle thereafter: faith, courage, and liberty. Because abundance is where things can change. That is the focus on material things, abundance. And material things we know is already not of nature. So nature is intervening right at the abundant stage. And of liberty, we're redefining it not as something written on paper, but as something of natural law. And as long as natural law is present, man's law cannot be present. And statism, as long as that is opposed, there can never be a government that turns into selfishness, complacency, apathy, dependence, and bondage. So this is a really key cycle to understanding the nature of the cycle of government, which is really key to know as to how things would go if people do not follow the course of nature, they do not follow natural law, and they keep following government and thinking they could just keep making it better. There will always be ups and downs in life, but it'll have major downs, especially as we move on with technology and other things, as I mentioned, that will increase the harm done. And what we're trying to do is reduce the harm so that this cycle can be one rather only on the right side, only on the right side, and nowhere near the left side. We can just keep it going from abundance back to faith, right? Realizing, okay, these material things, we need to find faith, go back to ourselves, faith in nature, faith in God, whatever that may be for yourself, because that helps you seek the spiritual, which the material is directly opposed to. You study Satanism, you know that its elements is supposed to be crushing the consciousness, crushing the spiritual with the physical. So at that turn of abundance, we can bring it back to faith, and that can be a continuous 4 cycle rather than this complex 9-step cycle. So thank you for understanding that. I know this could be a little crazy in the fact that over 200 years, this happens to most of every government, and we're reaching 200 years now with the United States of America. So why even say that if it doesn't exist? That's the thing. We have to get this illusion out of people's minds, because this illusion is what's creating the cycle, and we're not learning from history clearly because it is a cycle. And I'll remind you, yes, there's cycles natural in nature, which is why that happens, because nature opposes those bondage. Nature opposes that dependence, right? The natural law is like, okay, you've suppressed me way too long, but they are getting away with it now, and that's what I'm scared with. As you see, this cycle is even being prolonged because the 200 years have already gone by. This is the first time a government has gone by over 200 years. You have to question why that is. It's because people are so dumbed down now and so left up to less power that they really feel like they can't do anything about it, and there is no escape from bondage, from what it's coming to be. So, and they're carefully planning out their bondage too. It's not like they're going right to bondage. They're carefully planning it out, and that's the problem too. Is little steps. They're taking it real slow. They know that past governments have not worked. They're taking it real slow, and they're making sure to assure that their efforts are completed in the way that can work out in the long run. So what we're looking at here is also a long run agenda, but the diametrically opposed agenda, because we don't want government. We want the exact opposite. So funny how that works. If you study them, you can know exactly what to do as the opposite. It's just like saying, okay, well, if you're going to see this herd of sheep going toward one place, you want to be the exact opposite and probably not follow the herd of sheep. Okay, so this is the irony that we live in. Here you have a quote about the Tytler cycle, and it talks about who Alexander Tytler was. He was a Scottish advocate and judge, and he formulated the idea over 200 years ago. He was born around 1747 and died around 1813. Okay, he said, quote, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government." And as we know, republics are also democracies from the previous quote. I mean, this is like saying Republicans and Democrats are one and the same, which they are. Okay, then it says, quote, "A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that the voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury." Right? I mean, does your vote even matter? They say the vote is your voice. No, your voice is your voice. See how they denature certain things? It's like changing the definition of a rainbow, for example. I'm just putting that out there. Right? People will see things differently based on what they put in your face on the media and in the movies. Okay, this is how powerful our human bodies are to believe and also to manifest things in our lives. So realize this power not just done onto you, but the power that you have, that you allowed it to go into its motion. Then you realize that you are truly powerful, for the record. Then it says, quote, "From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by a dictatorship." And as we see, we have some really bad economics, and we see a collapse happening in civilization where many people believe it could be divide and conquer for even more control, especially since many people will be begging down to the government. So we really need to think different, and this is one of our best times to do this, even though this is something we could do anytime in case you're listening to this. So you have to take the action anytime you can, as soon as you can. So the average age, it says, quote, "The average age of the world's greatest civilizations from the beginning of history has been around 200 years. During those 200 years, these nations always progressed through the following sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependence, and from dependence back into bondage." So what could you learn from this Tytler cycle, being that we followed all this? Like I said, I think it's the nature of a government, essentially, in its cycle, looking at the greater scheme of things. And this is important to know, being if we want to create change in the future as a sort of movement ourselves, we're going to have cycles of our own in nature, but we want to make sure that that cycle doesn't turn into one of bringing up government again, because that's the main goal. And as long as that is kept out of the equation, we should be good as a human species, because government has been the very main suppressors of the human will and of the human consciousness. Now, technology about that, like I said, if you have governments mostly in control of technology, and they may press it when people are opposed to their agendas. However, people, again, are also in control of the technology. We're in control of everything. So they may have control over some technology, but as governments decline, I assure you that technology will likely decline with it. And in fact, you'll probably have more freedom on the web and so forth like that. There's going to be a lot more alternatives to Windows. And like I said, there's going to be a lot more potential, a lot more innovation occurring, and where you want to say, okay, well, that's more abundance. I think right now we live in a state of abundance, but we have this great material push. Whereas I think in the world I'm talking about, we have abundance, but we can also have much spiritual worth, because people will be promoting that more often, being that they see the importance of nature, being that their voices aren't censored, and that if it's actually working for them, then it's definitely something that is going to help them. And it's keeping each other accountable is a spiritual practice, through using our consciousness, and then recognizing natural law is a spiritual law. The very idea of abundance turning into something more than what it is not going to turn into anything worse, especially since government isn't existent. So it wouldn't turn into dependence and dictatorship, because who's the dictator if nobody's in charge? You see what I mean? This is what along the lines I'm going with. Now, if we were to do more research then on Alexander Tytler and his views on government, we'd see this, quote, "All government is essentially of the nature of a monarchy." Okay, it's just, to me, it's just so funny to me how I see this word nature thrown around, and I'm telling you, it's something that can really help us understand the world around us. And so you see it time and time again, and you see it among every leader that you've heard of under the sun that has been assassinated, or every leader who spoke out against the system, essentially. So, quote, "The people flatter them of the sovereign power. These are, in fact, words without meaning. It is true that they elected governors, but how are these elections brought about? In every instance of election by the mass of a people, through the influence of those governors themselves, and by means the most opposite to a free and disinterested choice, by the basest corruption and bribery. But those governors once elected, where is the boastest freedom of the people? They must submit to their rule and control with the same abandonment of their natural liberty, the freedom of their will, and the command of their actions, as if they were under the rule of a monarch." So he's saying at the very nature of any government, it's still the same thing as a monarch. It's just a different leader. It doesn't really matter. The same belief systems are being done here. And that's what he's going on, right? His belief system. This whole idea of selfishness to abundance, these are belief systems, which is why I believe this cycle is actually really, really crucial to understanding government. It's not just talking about what's happening, it's talking about the belief systems, it's talking about the why things are happening. So that quote was very powerful within itself. I encourage you to read it over yourself, in fact, if you want to look into this. And so then it says, quote, "Nothing better than a utopian theory, a splendid chimera, descriptive of a state of society that never did and never could exist, a republic not of men, but of angels." What he's saying is that men is trying to be God, and that governments are just trying to seek as a utopian theory, So, he's specifically talking about some of the more optimistic visions of democracy as written by other people who say that, okay, government could exist perfectly within this society or perfectly within that society. He's saying a republic not of men but of angels, it would have to be essentially of gods, for a utopian world. Well, guess what? Actually, funny irony enough, natural law is God's law. So if you are living under natural law, you're living among the angels. You're living among the gods. You are under God's rule, not some man who is fallen to Satanism, most likely. Then we have, quote, "While man is being instigated by the love of power, a passion visible in an infant and common to us even with the inferior animals, he will seek personal superiority in preference to every matter of a general concern." This is just so powerful to me, because this is now then talking about the nature of man and how man is seeking the love of power, and it's like a child and they're inferior, as we see Mark Twain is saying that we're the lowest animals. This is just so key. Okay, he will seek personal superiority in preference to every matter of a general concern, saying that they just want control everywhere, which is why they love war and they love material things, and it's just something that they constantly do within a daily life. Like, this is their practice, essentially. Instead, people could be practicing things of natural law, as I'm encouraging to do here, practicing love, practicing self-reflection, practicing, healing your body. That's all a practice. Instead, people are putting their practice toward superiority, toward these unnatural things. So guess what's going to manifest? Exactly that. Okay, that's how powerful human beings can be, but we are not gods at all. Okay, but you can definitely see the resemblance and the connection that we do have, being that is. Okay, then he says, quote, "Or at best he will employ himself in advancing the public good as the means of individual distinction and elevation. He will promote the interest of the state from the selfish but most useful passion of making himself considerable in that establishment which he labors to aggrandize. Such is the true picture of man as a political agent." So going again based on the nature that man is, becoming this political animal, political agent, and always going toward his own demise in a way. So then you have here from the Wikipedia, it says, Tytler believed that democratic forms of government, such as those of Greece and Rome, have a natural evolution from initial virtue toward eventual corruption and decline. In Greece, for example, Tytler argues that, quote, "The patriotic spirit and love of ingenious freedom became gradually corrupted as the nation advanced in power and splendor." right? They just have everything and everything is going great, which is why it started to go away. And you started to see that also with that quote, that very ironic quote that to live in a state of peace, it just created more war. Like, this is the irony that government has been creating. It's this play on the irony that is naturally existent, and it's making it more dangerous. Okay? Quote, patriotism. Okay, so listen to this, patriots. Patriotism always exists in the greatest degree in rude nations and in an early period of society. Like all other affections and passions, it operates with the greatest force where it meets with the greatest difficulties. But in a state of ease and safety, as if wanting its appropriate nourishment, it languishes and decays. It is a law of nature to which no experience has ever furnished an exception, that the rising grandeur and opulence of a nation must be balanced by the decline of its heroic virtues. So this is so amazing to me, because he's saying that this decline in nations, and he's rooting it back down to mentality. He's rooting it back down to the roots as to why is it that these nations are rising? Why is it that they're falling? And he says the law of nature. I mean, is this any more descriptive than what it has to be for what we're talking about? This is just incredible to me. And you could even do research among others who studied the cycles of governments, and one such people is also Ton B, somebody who I'm also not too familiar with, but I came across one of his works where he studies the cycles of governments, and this is what he has to say. Here you have the quote on the Wikipedia. It says, he argues that for civilizations to be born, the challenge must be the golden mean, that excessive challenge will crush the civilization and too little challenge will cause it to stagnate. Now this is also very reflective as to what we should be doing and what the mentalities are happening as well. Notice there's this also emphasis on mentality. Okay, so now we continue. Civilizations continue to grow only when they meet one challenge only to be met by another in a continuous cycle of challenge and response. Kind of like you want to maybe say problem, reaction, solution, right? But instead of us choosing the response, perhaps it's the elite saying, okay, this is what must happen in order for this to must happen. And that's how they've gotten a lot of control, is through setting up events and making sure events happen in the way that they want to, or they always have a backup plan so it works up in the way that they shall desire. He argues that civilizations develop in different ways due to their different environments and different approaches to the challenges they face. He argues that growth is driven by quote-unquote creative minorities, those who find solutions to the challenges, who inspire rather than compel others to follow their innovative lead. So, as you know, we've been talking about creativity is what allows people to move on and innovate. This is something that's going to be very crucial to moving on any movement such as our own. Okay? So he says creative minorities find solutions to the challenges a civilization faces, while the great mass follow these solutions by imitation, solutions they otherwise would be incapable of discovering on their own. Okay, so there's going to be people who find creative things, there's going to be other people who find creative things, and the idea here is to bring those ideas together and allow the masses, the many people, to also express their creative self and understand this creativity and its purpose among this cycle of life, okay, and the reasoning behind its movements, in this case of civilization, which is a movement within itself, which is why we are the one counter agenda, okay, a movement against such movement, because they want to move us in their direction. We want to move in the direction of nature, in the direction of righteous, moral, objective truth. Okay, in 1939 it says, Tolkien wrote, quote, the challenge of being called upon to create a political world order, the framework for an economic world order, now confronts our modern Western society. Now, this is really telling to a lot of people in the truth community. Using even the specific words world order, we know that we have been living in this new world order, and what they've wanted to be formed for quite a while into forming a world government, so to speak. You may call it a conspiracy all you want, but they write about it in their own writings as well. The bloodlines, those at the very top of the political structures. And that's why it says political world order, and then it says economic world order, because those we know who control the money supply control the rest of society. This is even said by the bankers themselves again. And it says our modern Western society, as we know, the Western society is often the most manipulated, often the most under attack, and often the ones who receive it the most from perhaps even other nations. Now, on the topic of breakdown and disintegration, Toynbee does not see the breakdown of civilizations as caused by loss of control over the physical environment, by loss of control over the human environment, or by attacks from the outside. He sees it rather that it comes from the deterioration of the creative minority, which eventually ceases to be creative and degenerates into merely a dominant minority. Okay, so this is really key, because if we are not using our consciousness, not using our willpower to create new things, who are the ones that are innovating? Those at the top, the dominant minority, those who just simply want to control others, given the current environment, given any environment, they seek control. So if you do not have a creative minority, this creative group of individuals who can help bring this new side every once in a while to change things up, you do have this degeneration into a dominant minority. This is what he's saying as his theory for this cycle of governance. And he argues that creative minorities deteriorate due to a worship of their quote-unquote former self, by which they become prideful and fail adequately to address the next challenge they face. So they are not innovating, essentially. They are not being an innovative society. They're not moving toward as much as they should. And of course, this is specifically talking about a civilization, a government, okay, which does not have creative minorities. It does not have these creative aspects that are essential to the human cause. And when you realize that these creative aspects are rooted within nature, and that nature is what provides a lot of this creativity, and seeking our true selves and our true destiny, because we each have our own creative place, when you realize that's coming from nature, not from the governments, then you start to connect the dots even more. So it says, results of the breakdown. The final breakdown results in, quote, positive acts of creation. The dominant minority seeks to create a universal state to preserve its power and influence, and the internal proletariat seeks to create a universal church to preserve its spiritual values and cultural norms. So a universal state, a universal church, perhaps a universal monetary supply, I would assume then too, right? And everything else universal coming from that government, because they need a system to maintain this quote-unquote universal state. And as we see, as he even described by world order, we start to connect the dots there, and it starts to make sense. A new world order is supposed to represent this world governance, to which a universal state, as he describes here, does then make sense. And being that that is breaching the Western world, it's just a matter of when people will wake up, if we want to get rid of that system from manifesting in its works as it is right now. So, and we have to be careful, right? Because we see this accountability, we see this decline of creativity. We see that right now in our society, where that's giving way to a dominant minority. Okay, and we have to understand that when we have creativity, when we have human consciousness, when we have natural law, and then when we have man's law, a lot of these things are going to conflict with one another. And we have to understand, how is it that they conflict? And this, one of these researchers, like him and Tytler, they're just more examples of how we can understand our world a little bit better through the lens of cycles and progression. And he goes about this idea that without creativity you have these norms in place, these societal norms, these standards, these boundaries, if you will,
from creativity, shall you see it like that. And he even made a prediction here. It says, it remains to be seen what will come of the 4 remaining civilizations of the 21st century. You have Western civilization, Islamic society, Hindu society, and the Far East, from his predictions, right? So he says, Tone B argues 2 possibilities. They might all merge with the Western civilization, or Western civilization might develop a universal state after its quote-unquote time of troubles decay and die. So we see projections if we were to continue in this lens of government. But we also see what creates government, what helps disintegrate it, and that is the key, shall we want to move forward in the right direction.
The light.